the quest for Planet X. Percival Lowell was the most obsessive and ultimately the sole indispensable figure among the mathematical pioneers of trans-Neptunian space. Although primarily recognized for his connection to the canals of Mars and theories about extraterrestrial life on the planet, he dedicated a significant portion of the final decade of his life to a substantial yet clandestine pursuit of an undiscovered planet beyond Neptune, Planet X. Lowell was born on March 13, 1855, on Tremont Street, opposite Boston Common. His earliest memory dates back to age 3, while residing in a vertically arranged mansion on Park Avenue. From the window of a spiral staircase, he observed Donati's comet, characterized by a magnificent scimitar-like curve, representing the most majestic celestial object retained in living memory. He never forgot this experience. A man with a penchant for luxury, he was inclined to cultivate intense passions that tested his capabilities and facilitated the expression of his individuality. Furthermore, the family's financial resources enabled him to pursue his interests extensively, which he did, traveling around the globe and beyond. The Lowells have ancestral ties to Massachusetts dating back to the Mayflower. Percival Lowell, a Bristol wholesale trader in imports and exports, emigrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in August 1638 at 67 and settled in Newbury. Subsequent family members exerted significant influence in New England for generations. The family's material wealth primarily stemmed from the endeavors of Francis Cabot Lowell, an industrialist who introduced the power loom he observed in the cotton mills of Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds to the banks of the Charles River. After his demise in 1817, the operation moved from its original site in Waltham to East Chelmsford, located along the Merrimack River. The textile mill city, named Lowell in his honor, emerged almost instantaneously, as the poet John Greenleaf Whittier noted, like the enchanted palaces of Arabian tales. The city's most notable characteristic was its intricate system of canals, a feat accomplished by James B. Francis, who designed the most significant of these, the Northern Canal. By 1850, Lowell had emerged as the second largest city in Massachusetts, following Boston, featuring 6 miles of canals traversing the area. The canals functioned on dual levels to activate water wheels, energizing 320,000 spindles and nearly 10,000 looms, while employing over 10,000 workers. The canals relied on water sourced from the Merrimack. However, the mill proprietors dammed the river to enhance efficiency and stored the water overnight for subsequent use. Foreseeing seasonal droughts, they transformed the river's watershed into an expansive mill pond and vigorously secured water rights extending to New Hampshire, accumulating water in lakes during spring and discharging it into the Merrimack in summer and autumn. Those acquainted with Percival Lowell cannot overlook the significance of canals in shaping the aspirations of the future astronomer. At the time of Percival's birth, the Lowells had established themselves as New England's preeminent capitalist family, referred to as economic royalists or robber barons. Alongside capitalist families such as the Lawrence, Appletons, Cabots, and Jacksons, they dominated 1/5 of America's cotton production by 1850, constructing an economic, social, and political empire. The Lowells were cotton Whigs who supported the perpetuation of the South's peculiar institution, unlike the conscience Whigs who advocated for its abolition. Nevertheless, surviving the Civil War, their business interests were extensive and enduring. They contributed to the development of the Boston and Lowell Railroad, possessed controlling shares in multiple Boston financial institutions, and provided underwriting and insurance for companies. They also established Boston's cultural and educational institutions, creating the core of the elite class that Oliver Wendell Holmes famously termed the Boston Brahmins. Augustus Lowell led the most affluent branch of the family. His father, John Amory Lowell, maintained the family's wealth within the lineage through 2 marriages to cousins. Augustus achieved a similar objective by marrying Catherine Bigelow Lawrence, the daughter of Abbott Lawrence, a family business associate and co-founder of Lawrence, Massachusetts, who led another affluent textile dynasty. Percival Lowell, the firstborn of Augustus and Catherine, was a privileged heir. His father, a quintessential Brahmin, was characterized by his eldest son as a man who acted for results, and although he never seemed to care to theorize, appreciated the theories of others as long as they did not conflict with the Puritanism he inherited in a highly concentrated form. He was astutely correct and consistently effective. However, his stern demeanor rendered him seemingly hard. His mother, who indulged Percy and to whom he remained exceptionally devoted, was a partial invalid suffering from chronic renal disease, likely exacerbated by the demands of multiple childbirths, including, between 1855 and 1862, Percival, Abbott Lawrence, the twins Roger and Catherine, of whom only Catherine survived, and Elizabeth. A 12-year interval ensued for Amy, referred to within the family as the postscript, who achieved success as a poet. During the Civil War, the family traveled to Europe, where Percival studied French at a dame school, and his mother attempted to restore her health at various spas. Upon their return, they established residence in a house on 10 acres along the western slope of Heath Street, a rural thoroughfare in Brookline. It was sufficiently proximate to Boston while remaining safe to avoid urban encroachment. Augustus subsequently referred to it as Sevenals, in honor of the 7 Lowells residing there. In 1870, Percy positioned a telescope, gifted by his mother, on the house's flat roof to observe Mars. He attended Harvard, where then-President Charles W. Eliot promoted a harmonious and balanced curriculum. Percy, a graduate of 1876, epitomized Eliot's ideal, excelling in English composition and mathematics. His mathematics instructor was Benjamin Peirce, from whom he acquired knowledge of celestial mechanics. Peirce called him the finest student mathematician of all those I have observed. A significant commendation, considering Simon Newcomb was among his former students. Following Neptune's discovery, Percy was certainly cognizant of Peirce's happy accident hypothesis. Following his graduation, Percy was invited to remain as a mathematics instructor. However, he was hesitant to commit. So he opted for an 8-month grand tour across Europe and Syria with his cousin Harcourt Amory. His correspondence with friends from home indicates he may have experienced an extended adolescent identity crisis. There is a palpable oppression, a feeling of oppressive, somber furniture and draperies akin to the decor at Sevenals, suffocating his spirit. At the commencement of the pivotal year 1877, the year in which the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli would proclaim the discovery of the canals of Mars, he corresponded with his friend, the future literary historian Barrett Wendell. "I trust that Chastity Hall remains, as in former times, a venue for many enjoyable moments, and that you appreciate my enduring qualities. As for myself, I have become distinctly misanthropic, and, aside from a select few friends, would not experience significant regret at the prospect of relocating to another planet, or ceasing to exist, if either option were feasible." Upon returning from the grand tour, Percy worked at his father's office on State Street, where he delved into his Planet X calculations. He had a remarkable aptitude for numerical analysis that could have yielded substantial wealth. However, being already affluent, he prioritized the good over the goods, as he articulated. Overwhelmed by anxiety regarding a career in commerce and an impending arranged marriage, he was recently engaged to a Brahmin woman named Alice Lee, the daughter of Boston banker George Cabot Lee and sister-in-law to the emerging New York Assemblyman Theodore Roosevelt. He withdrew from business and terminated the engagement. By undertaking such actions, particularly the latter, Percy had perpetrated an irredeemable transgression within the elite, rigid society in which he resided. Boston society was engulfed in scandal, leaving his family in disbelief. Augustus was incensed by his eldest son's reckless and egocentric choice to flutter in the breeze, a phrase from one of Sister Amy's later poems, prompting him to impose stringent oversight on Percy's financial matters until well after his 30th birthday. Nevertheless, the family never threatened to disinherit him, and Augustus continued to grant him, as he did all his offspring, $100,000. This amount would equate to millions in contemporary terms, and Percy was astute enough to augment it through investments. By 1900, the year of Augustus's demise, Percy's wealth had expanded to $500,000, approximately $13 million in present-day currency. And by the time of his own passing in 1916, it had escalated to $2 million, $44 million today. He was a millionaire when the term retained significance. Financial constraints were non-existent. He was perpetually free to act according to his desires. From the Far East to the distant West, Lowell was gratified to distance himself from Boston as much as possible. Indeed, following the scandal regarding the engagement, he could scarcely have persisted in residing there with any semblance of comfort. Conversely, he relocated to the opposite side of the globe. Inspired by an 1882 lecture series on feudal Japan, presented by zoologist Edward Sylvester Morse at the Lowell Institute, which was endowed by another Lowell and whose sole trustee at the time was Augustus Lowell, he embarked on a journey to the Far East the following year. He would reside there for much of the subsequent decade and author 4 books detailing his observations and experiences. Chosun, The Land of the Morning Calm, concerning Korea; The Soul of the Far East, Noto, and Occult Japan. Lowell's fascination with the Far East waned when he embarked on his final journey to Japan in December 1892. He lacked a definitive understanding of his forthcoming passion, yet he tried to meet with the renowned Lick Observatory astronomer E before departing from San Francisco. He also transported a 6-inch Clark refractor telescope to Tokyo, with which he observed Saturn. In November 1893, as he departed from Yokohama Bay en route to San Francisco, he had not yet determined his subsequent course of action. He was considering a potential Easter excursion to Seville with affluent companion Ralph Curtis. Nevertheless, shortly thereafter, the decision was irrevocably made. The pivotal moment occurred during Christmas 1893 when he was gifted by his Aunt Mary, sister of poet James Russell Lowell, a copy of Camille Flammarion's tome La planète Mars et ses conditions d'habitabilité, The Planet Mars and its Conditions of Habitability, a substantial volume published in 1892 that encapsulated the history of Martian research and featured extensive translations from Schiaparelli's memoirs regarding the canals, alongside Flammarion's fervent endorsement of the notion that the planet teemed with life, including intelligent life. Subsequently, Lowell was completely enamored with Mars. As a native Bostonian, he would have articulated it as Mars. In late January 1894, he encountered William H. Pickering, a junior astronomer at the Harvard College Observatory and the younger sibling of the director, Edward Charles Pickering. At that time, the younger Pickering was acknowledged as a prominent authority on Mars, and he, along with his assistant Andrew Ellicott Douglas, had recently returned from observing the planet in Peru. Lowell and Pickering concurred on an expedition to the Arizona Territory in the American Southwest, where Pickering anticipated that the atmospheric conditions would be as favorable for planetary observation as those he had encountered in Peru. Pickering consented to a 1-year sabbatical from the observatory to participate in the expedition, and Lowell also secured Douglas's assistance. The latter was dispatched westward early that spring with the identical 6-inch telescope Lowell had utilized in Tokyo to survey Arizona locations with the most stable atmosphere, and consequently, the most advantageous seeing conditions. He arrived in Tombstone in early March, traveling to Tucson, where he regrettably faced inclement weather, before continuing north to Tempe, Phoenix, Prescott, and Ash Fork. In early April, he arrived in Flagstaff, a lumber town situated 7,000 feet on the Colorado Plateau, and strategically positioned along the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad line. On April 5th and 6th, Douglas assessed the visibility conditions as 8 on a 10-point scale at a clearing in the woods on the hill west of town, referred to as Site 11. This outcome surpassed any he had previously encountered. Lowell, who stayed in Boston to edit the page proofs of Occult Japan, grew increasingly eager to commence. He was keenly cognizant that time was of the essence, with Mars's subsequent advantageous alignment with Earth anticipated in October, merely 6 months hence. Lowell promptly telegraphed Douglas to identify the observatory in Flagstaff. The observatory was rapidly constructed using borrowed telescopes, including a 12-inch Clark refracting telescope from Harvard, and an 18-inch Brassier refractor, temporarily redirected from its intended location at the Flower Observatory in Philadelphia, along with a prefabricated dome designed by Pickering and shipped in components. On May 22, 1894, before he departed for the Arizona Territory, Lowell delivered a lecture to the Boston Scientific Society outlining his objective: to examine the canals of Mars during the planet's subsequent advantageous proximity to Earth. He already possessed concrete opinions regarding what he would discover. He stated, "We are observing the outcome of the efforts of some intelligent entities. The notable blue network on Mars implies the existence of life on a planet distinct from our own." Mars Observer. Lowell arrived in Flagstaff on May 28, 1894. Pickering and Douglas had been temporarily accommodated at the Bank Hotel opposite the railroad station. However, on that initial night, an enthusiastic Lowell and Pickering opted to camp in the uncarved dome to prepare for the early observation of Mars, which remained a considerable distance from Earth. Unfortunately, clouds obscured the sky that night, resulting in rain. On May 31st, the weather improved, allowing Lowell to observe the planet for the first time using a 12-inch telescope. The subsequent night, he utilized an 18-inch telescope for his observations. So began an adventure that still seems among the most romantic ever undertaken in the history of astronomy. From the large canvas-covered dome on the elevation that Lowell was soon called Mars Hill, he and his colleagues Pickering and Douglas kept under close scrutiny the world that was agreed to be the most like our own. Lowell was only a part-time observer, perhaps spurred by anxiety over his mother's failing health. She died the following April. He returned to Boston during July and much of August, then traveled back to Flagstaff in late August, returned to Boston again in early September, and finally came back to Flagstaff for the period of Mars's closest approach in October and November. During his absences, Pickering and Douglas continued to monitor the planet. Lowell struggled to see any canals through the eyepiece for the first month. In time, however, he trained himself to capture fine details revealed in flashes of superior seeing. His learning curve, combined no doubt with the changing phenomena on the planet, can be read in his observing logbooks. In contrast with his bland early efforts, the drawings that fill the later pages are replete with spindly features. Primarily in the library at Severnals rather than the observatory on Mars Hill, Lowell developed his renowned and contentious theory of intelligent life on Mars during that summer. He presented it to the public through a 6-part series of articles in Popular Astronomy from September 1894 to April 1895, a lecture series at Boston's Huntington Hall in 1895, February 1895, 4 articles in the Atlantic Monthly, published between May and August 1895, and ultimately in his best-selling book, Mars, which drew partially from his earlier articles. The book was released in December 1895, shortly before he departed for Europe, a routine he maintained every other year until 1914. His notions regarding Mars, articulated in ornate language, captivated the public, yet elicited a critical response from prominent astronomers, who underscored the challenges of accurately discerning details on another planet from Earth-based observations. While Lowell and his team were delineating canals from Flagstaff, Barnard was observing the planet at the Lick Observatory on Mount Hamilton using a 36-inch Clark refractor telescope. This instrument featured a larger aperture than Lowell's and benefited from the high-altitude atmosphere and gentle winds from the Pacific Ocean. Under these optimal conditions, Barnard discerned significant surface details on Mars, including mountains and elevated plateaus. However, no canals were observed. He communicated this to Simon Newcomb. "I struggled to accept Schiaparelli's canals as represented. I perceive details that he has not illustrated. I observe features associated with some of his canals, which are not linear. Upon closer examination, these details appear irregular and dispersed. Despite thorough investigations, certain sections of the canals do not exist, as Schiaparelli depicts. This will be substantiated before we have numerous favorable opportunities for observation." Lowell nevertheless pressed on. In the summer of 1896, Lowell invested $20,000, equivalent to more than $500,000 today, to purchase a new permanent telescope. This telescope was a 24-inch 61 centimeters refractor, equipped with a jewel of a lens. According to its maker, Alvan Graham Clark, this lens was the most optically perfect of all the large lenses his celebrated firm had made. 10. It was housed in a wedding cake dome built by Flagstaff man-of-all-work Godfrey Sykes that was intended to be readily taken apart, shipped, and reassembled elsewhere. Indeed, that was to be the fate of both the telescope and the dome. They were shipped to Tacubaya, outside Mexico City, in time for the December 1896 opposition of Mars. Though Pickering had returned to Harvard, Douglas was still on board and took charge of the Tacubaya installation. Two other assistants, T.J.J.C. and Wilbur A. Coggeshall, joined the staff. They were already using the telescope weeks before Lowell himself arrived at the end of December, by which time it was too late to do much with Mars. Opportunistically, Lowell used the telescope to make observations of Mercury and Venus and immediately waded deep into controversy. Venus, the most striking of all planets visible to the unaided eye, has historically disappointed telescopic observers. Most astronomers found its brilliant disk nearly devoid of features and considered the planet's surface perpetually obscured by a highly reflective, unyielding cloud cover, a fact that remains unchanged today. In contrast, Lowell promptly sketched a spoke-like system of markings on the disk, a monochromatic design consistent and distinct from prior observations. He believed he was observing through a thin haze directly onto the planet's surface, which he theorized was composed of exposed rock formations protruding from the sand. Additionally, he concluded that the planet consistently presented the same face as the Sun. While all his assistants noted remnants of his marking system, it was his secretary, Rexy Louise Leonard, whose illustrations most accurately captured Lowell's distinctive effects. Lowell's Venus analysis exemplifies an overinterpretation of ambiguous observations, bordering on imaginative excess. The astronomical community's response was immediate and vehement. Lowell asserted that his proposed canals appeared more natural than those on Mars. Nonetheless, most astronomers perceived little distinction. If the markings on Venus were not canals, they bore a striking resemblance to them. Several astronomers could not refrain from labeling them as canals. Lowell, overwhelmed and unaccustomed to dissent, suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Upon returning from Mexico, he made a brief stop in Boston before heading to Flagstaff, intending to continue his research but advancing no further than Chicago. Astronomically, he was rendered inactive for 4 years. Lowell's recovery progressed gradually with intermittent episodes. His father's doctor recommended the rest cure. Lowell tried it for a month, found it intolerable, and abandoned it for a regimen of travel, exercise, and sunshine. The most important thing for Lowell was to steer clear of any topics that could agitate him. First and foremost, that meant Venus. Finally, by 1901, he had recovered enough to return to Flagstaff, eager for vindication. His first priority was to fire Douglas, who had been running the observatory during Lowell's illness, and had developed an independent streak regarding the markings on Venus and Mars. He thought them mostly illusions. With Douglas's departure, Lowell resolved to carry on, alone if necessary. "I'm so much at home here," he told his sister Elizabeth, "and yet no one I know knows it." 12. Lowell decided to buy a spectrograph from an optician in Pennsylvania named John Brasshere. He wanted to use it to study Venus, confirm its long rotation period, and support earlier observations about a spoke system related to this. Then, despite his disillusionment with assistants, he honored an earlier promise to his former assistant Coggeshall, now at Indiana University in Bloomington, to hire recent IU graduate Vesto Melvin Slipher to operate the instrument. Slipher arrived in 1901 and began working temporarily. Ultimately, he would remain at the observatory for 53 years until his retirement in 1954. He was the first of several assistant astronomers hired from IU. Others included Carl Otto Lampland and Slipher's brother Earl. Their scientific skills, caution, and sheer durability would help assure the observatory's future long after Lowell himself was gone. By 1903, Slipher had achieved sufficient competence with the spectrograph to announce, to Lowell's enormous satisfaction, that Venus's rotation was indeed slow, and probably equal to its period of revolution around the Sun, 225 days. Unfortunately, this success did little to restore Lowell's reputation among his professional astronomical peers, or quiet the din of criticism to which he was subjected. 13. Against this backdrop, Lowell's quest for the trans-Neptunian planet took shape. A quest that would eventually lead to the discovery of the world hereafter to be our main, if not exclusive, concern. From modest beginnings at the turn of the 20th century, it would grow into one of the principal preoccupations of Lowell's last decade. While grappling with the intricacies of celestial mechanics was undoubtedly appealing, Lowell also saw mathematics as a means to achieve results immune to the criticisms his observations of Mars and Venus had provoked. Clyde Tombaugh recalled, "Carl Lampland told me Lowell desperately wanted to improve his credibility among other astronomers." So, Lowell thought, if he could predict the location of a ninth planet beyond Neptune and then find it, it would surely improve his status. Planet X. Lowell attributed his fascination with the potential existence of trans-Neptunian planets to his 1901 examination of a catalogue of comet orbits compiled by Galley, the optical discoverer of Neptune. From this he discerned the concept of comet families and hypothesized the existence of two planets located at distances of 48 astronomical units and 74 astronomical units from the Sun. He briefly referenced these findings during a series of lectures on the solar system at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in December 1902. Following the discussion of Jupiter's comet family, he noted that Jupiter is not the sole planet possessing one. All the massive planets possess similar characteristics. Saturn possesses 2 moons, Uranus also has 2, and Neptune has 6. While the regions between these planets are devoid of cometophilia. The voids demonstrate the phenomenon. The action does not cease there. By plotting the aphelia of all observed comets, we initially identify clusters corresponding to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune families as we distance ourselves from the Sun. Nevertheless, the clusters extend beyond Neptune. Beyond that planet lies a void, followed by 2 additional aphelia at 49 and 50 astronomical units, with no further objects until reaching 75 units. The improbability of the coincidence implies the existence of an undiscovered planet that will eventually be identified and incorporated with the others. Consequently, we now recognize comets as essential elements of our system, functioning as indicators of uncharted planets. Undoubtedly, he was greatly indebted to Flammarion for this line of reasoning. Lowell has provided no indication of his interest in further investigating the issue. In contrast, there are no additional mentions of trans-Neptunian planets in Lowell's published works, or the Lowell Observatory archives until early 1905. He was concurrently conducting multiple independent investigations at that time, as was his customary practice. He and Lampland were preparing to utilize a new planetary camera to attempt to capture images of the canals on Mars during the planet's advantageous opposition in May 1905. Attaining this success would further elevate his standing among astronomers. He informed Lampland, "We will produce something to capture attention." He was concurrently composing a new book on Mars and its canals, which he intended to complete by June 1906. The numerous drafts and revisions preserved in the Lowell Observatory archives indicate that this work caused him significantly more distress than his other publications. He envisioned it as his magnum opus on the Red Planet, and it ultimately became so. In addition to his usual Mars-related endeavors, he commenced a systematic investigation to ascertain the prospective planet signaled by the comets. The investigation was unique. While his astronomical endeavors were typically prominent and widely reported, details regarding Planet X, as he referred, were to be communicated discreetly. Even members of his own staff were granted access to Planet X information solely on a strict need-to-know basis. In February 1905, Lowell corresponded with Edward Pickering at the Harvard College Observatory and Camille Flammarion in France, soliciting astrographic charts of star fields along the invariable plane. The invariable plane, also referred to as Laplace's invariable plane, represents the weighted average of all planetary orbital and rotational planes. Due to Jupiter's significant mass, the invariable plane is within half a degree of Jupiter's orbital plane. This was the most likely region to locate a concealed planet, rather than the plane of the Earth's diminutive orbit, the ecliptic. Subsequently, he engaged a human computer, William F. Carrigan, of the NAO, to calculate the residuals, the disparity between the observed and theoretical positions, of Uranus and Neptune. Like the mathematical planet seekers of the 19th century, obtaining a robust set of residuals would provide the foundation for any mathematical analysis of perturbations caused by undiscovered planets. The initial constant plane investigation. Mars consistently remained Lowell's primary focus until his death, despite his unaltered fundamental beliefs regarding the planet. Every alternate year, including May 1905, when he commenced the trans-Neptunian project, Mars was optimally positioned for observation, occupying a significant portion of Lowell and his assistant's time. In April 1905, he established the Lawrence Fellowship, named in honor of his mother. Slipher and Lampland acknowledged their inability to manage the additional workload required for a thorough search for Planet X. The fellowship was established with Indiana University, IU, to offer several astronomy graduates practical experience in stellar observation and assist them with their thesis research. Concurrently, they received a modest remuneration of $50 per month. In reality, they would have minimal opportunity to engage in their thesis research, dedicating nearly all their time in Flagstaff to photographing the invariant plane. Lowell employed 3 Lawrence Fellows: John C. Duncan, 1905 to 1906, Earl C. Slipher, 1906 to 1907, Vesto's younger sibling, who would be retained as permanent staff, and Kenneth P. Williams, 1907. Following several test exposures conducted by Lampland using the 24-inch Clark telescope, which had an insufficiently small 1-degree square field for the intended purpose, a 5-inch wide field lens, produced by the Viennese optical company Voigtländer, was subsequently tested. Duncan commenced testing it in September 1905. It produced a field 15 degrees wide, with distinct boundaries over 10 degrees. Duncan dispatched the initial invariable plane plates acquired to Lowell's Boston office. Lowell was in England proclaiming Lampley's purported success in capturing images of certain Martian canals, and did not scrutinize them until early December. Despite Duncan's growing dissatisfaction with this lens, V.M. Slipher encouraged him to utilize it to acquire another set of plates encompassing the same celestial regions. On November 29th, Slipher discovered an image that he interpreted as that of a comet. He dispatched the plate to Lowell, who proclaimed the discovery to the Harvard College Observatory. On December 29th, Lowell declared the discovery of another comet, characterized by two tails, on the same photographic plate. By that time, sufficient time had elapsed for the discoveries to be corroborated elsewhere. However, Lick Observatory astronomer Robert G. Aitken wittily observed, "The discovery of a comet through photography is sufficiently rare to be significant, but identifying two on a single plate constitutes a singular accomplishment." He could not refrain from noting that photographic anomalies frequently resemble comet tails, and added, tinged with sarcasm, "It is, of course, presumed that Professor Lowell took measures to prevent such misinterpretations prior to declaring the discoveries." 19. William Graves. Hoyt, a historian at Lowell Observatory, asserts, "No other astronomers appear to have observed the alleged comets. We briefly tested an alternative wide-field lens measuring 6.375 inches instead of the Voigtländer, but it was equally unsatisfactory. In January 1906, the observatory acquired a more appropriate instrument, a 5-inch doublet lens produced by the Pittsburgh optician John Brassier, which achieved a limiting magnitude of 16 and featured a sharply defined field of approximately 5 degrees. From that time until September 1907, Duncan, Earl, Slipher, and Williams utilized it to expose pairs of photographic plates across the entire invariable plane. The Lawrence Fellowship concluded at that juncture. The program yielded a proliferation of asteroids, but discovered no new planets. This initial survey was merely an opportunity. Due to his competitive nature and strong independence, Lowell faced numerous distractions and seldom solicited counsel. This necessitated time for him and his aides to resolve matters independently. The preliminary photographic survey, conducted with substandard equipment, wasted several months of precious time before the decision to utilize the 5-inch Brassier lens. The methods employed to scrutinize the plates were rudimentary. Lowell stacked one plate atop another and inspected them manually with a magnifying glass. This was exceedingly inefficient. Adverse fortune also contributed. Tombaugh noted that following the discovery of Pluto, the nearest approximation to Planet X that astronomers would encounter, Pluto's significantly inclined orbit from 1905 to 1907 positioned it distant from the ecliptic and beyond the range of plates utilizing the 5-inch Brassier telescope. At that time, it was a 16th magnitude object, significantly dimmer than the 11th or 12th magnitude object Lowell anticipated, and at the extreme threshold of the search plates. Although the outcome was unfavorable, as Hoyt indicates, this initial photographic search yielded valuable insights on effectively conducting a search. The findings indicated that randomly searching trans-Neptunian space for an object believed to exist, yet about which no information was available, was futile. Lowell recognized the necessity of a finger post to indicate general regions where an undiscovered planet could be concealed among the stars in the sky. Remaining quantities. Lowell was already diligently seeking such indicators. At that time, only one or two highly skilled experts in celestial mechanics recognized the deficiencies in the methodology. Thus, John Herschel's graphical method was still considered the most straightforward means to ascertain the position of an unknown planet. In the graphical method, we contrasted a planet's anticipated position with its actual position. The discrepancies, termed residuals, were graphed, and the apex points on the chart were linked to potential alignments with the unidentified planet that influenced its trajectory. Errors may arise from either the theoretical or observational aspects. The quest for an undiscovered planet depended on Uranus, as Neptune was unobserved for a prolonged duration. Astronomers considered the few accidental observations made before William Herschel's 1781 discovery highly erroneous. Consequently, Newcomb, when calculating his own tables of Uranus in 1873, was hesitant to depend on them entirely. The observations made after 1781 were significantly more precise, yet they were not without criticism. Newcomb had composed, "To maintain data consistency, we must re-evaluate most observations before 1850. This entails employing updated values for comparison, and evaluating each observation against the contemporary geocentric position derived from recent theories. A reduction and comparison would be highly advantageous. The execution would, however, require a level of labor significantly beyond what the author can currently allocate to the problem. We must utilize the existing reductions and implement these corrections to a coherent system of star positions that we can readily ascertain." Certainly, the theories regarding planetary motion also encompassed uncertainties. As Lowell would subsequently indicate, nonetheless, the theory addresses only a minor fraction of the residual perturbations that effective card shuffling fails to eliminate. We lack assurance that our presumed elements are authentic, but they represent the optimal achievable, under the presumption that no unknown factors exist. Every planetary theory is consequently subject to skepticism, appearing more flawless than it truly is. Individuals have skillfully manipulated it to seem accurate, yet its apparent validity obscures its dubious nature. Lowell enlisted William F. Carrigan to undertake the laborious task of recalculating the residuals for Uranus and Neptune during the early phases of his planetary search. Carrigan was 40 years old, and as an employee of the NAO, dedicated his work hours to performing extensive calculations for the American Ephemeris and Nautical Almanac. Despite the demands of his primary employment, he was sufficiently motivated, or perhaps desperate, for supplementary income to consent to allocate as much time as possible to perform additional calculations for Lowell. Hoyt refers to him as the overlooked individual in Lowell's Planet X investigation. He was not a laborer but a proficient mathematical astronomer who published articles in prominent astronomical journals. Lowell, however, was reluctant to seek his counsel on perturbation theory. He merely desired his role as a laborer. Lowell's correspondence with Carrigan, located in the Lowell Observatory archives, illustrates the inconsistent advancement of the human computer in the project. It also illustrates Lowell's contradictory standards of desiring meticulous and thorough execution, while exhibiting growing impatience for outcomes and a preference for cost reduction. In March 1908, Carrigan completed the initial phase of his extensive research and submitted to Lowell the recalculated residuals of Uranus from 1780 to 1820. Lowell was keen for him to continue with the data from 1820 to 1900, while also recommending a more efficient method, advising Carrigan, "I should not include every observation, but rather select only a few of the most significant for each year." Consistent with precedent, Lowell's agenda was replete with various assignments. He was occupied with organizing the publication of his 1907 Mars observations, promoting V.M. Slipher's January 1908 spectrographic endeavor to identify water vapor in Mars's atmosphere, which appeared to have been successful at the time, and preparing his latest series of Lowell Institute lectures for publication, as Mars as the Abode of Life. He was negotiating with the Alvan Clark and Sons firm for a new 40-inch 102-centimeter reflector, which he hoped would validate the existence of the Martian canals for skeptics who asserted they were indiscernible in large apertures. Furthermore, in June 1908, he yielded to persistent pleas and transitioned from bachelorhood to matrimony. His fiancée was Constance Savage Keith, his neighbor from Boston, an interior decorator and a Back Bay real estate investor. Following their wedding in New York City, the couple embarked on a summer honeymoon in Europe, during which a notable event was Lowell's balloon ascension with his cousin, A.L. Roch, the founder of the Blue Hill Meteorological Observatory, ascended into the skies above London to capture images of the intersecting pathways in Hyde Park for comparison with the Martian Canal system. Upon Lowell's return from Europe in early October, he took no action to resume his theoretical trans-Neptunian exploration. It did not appear to be urgent. However, this situation altered when his former collaborator in establishing the Lowell Observatory, William H. Pickering, made a shocking declaration. A rival emerges. Pickering's extant notebooks, housed in the archives of Tulane University in New Orleans, indicate that his recorded fascination with a trans-Neptunian planet, or planets, akin to Lowell's, also originates from 1905. Like Lowell, he examined lists of comets to ascertain potential families associated with distant planets and identified 3 candidates. Following this preliminary and unpublished inquiry, Pickering promptly expanded his research. However, unlike Newcomb's recommendation and Carrigan's efforts for Lowell, he did not endeavor to recalculate the residuals. Instead, he emulated Todd's approach and graphically represented the residuals as outlined by Leverrier in his 1873 Memoir. This approach was precarious. Leverrier's theory of Uranus had become obsolete, having been replaced by the updated theories of Newcomb in 1873 and again in 1900, and Leverrier's protégé Jean-Baptiste Aimable Guyot, 1903. These theories employed various elements, specifically differing masses for the planets, resulting in inherently contradictory residuals. The entire issue hinged on the residuals. Varying masses would yield distinct solutions for the unidentified planet. Pickering overlooked these challenges and inferred the existence of a planet designated O, named as such, because O follows N for Neptune in the alphabet. Pickering's results were analogous to Todd's in 1877 due to his utilization of the same residuals. Assuming a circular orbit for O, Pickering determined that its average distance was 51.9 astronomical units, its orbital period was 373.5 years, and its mass was double that of Earth. He also provided its approximate position, for epoch 1909.0, are 7 hours 47 minutes, December, plus 21 degrees. This would have positioned it, if it had existed, in the eastern region of Gemini. Pluto was subsequently located in the adjacent constellation of Taurus. Neptune occupied Gemini in proximity to the hypothesized O's location. Before disseminating his findings, Pickering conducted a clandestine search for the planet, yet no evidence was discovered. On November 11, 1908, during a meeting of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Pickering presented his paper in the presence of Lowell. After their conversation, he sent Lowell a note, proposing that the latter might consider searching for his planet from Flagstaff. Lowell replied succinctly, "I am independently researching the entire topic and have not progressed sufficiently to initiate any visual search. I will inform you once I have a position." Notwithstanding Lowell's indifferent reaction, Pickering's article incited a crisis by disclosing that Lowell confronted at least one formidable competitor. The immediate impact on Lowell indicates that the signature of the perturbing planet in Uranus's residuals may have been more significant than he had anticipated. Following his prolonged disposition of generally patient comprehension towards Carrigan, he abruptly commenced daily reprimands of his computer, with letters soliciting new data and residuals. He was now resolute in attempting the empirical graphical method independently. As a result of this concerted effort, he created multiple graphs of residuals for Uranus, Jupiter, and Saturn. A graph depicting the residuals of Jupiter from Bouvard's tables exhibited 3 peaks corresponding to conjunctions with the previously unidentified Neptune. Upon this revelation, Lowell remarked to Carrigan, "It seems we might have located Neptune from the residuals of Jupiter." This stage of Lowell's inquiry persisted until the spring of 1909, when Pickering released a somewhat augmented version of the paper he had presented the preceding November. Lowell meticulously reviewed the document and inscribed annotations in the margins of his copy. He immediately recognized that Pickering had already explored much of the same territory as he had. For example, Pickering had also observed the peaks associated with Jupiter's conjunctions in Neptune's residuals. Lowell observed that Pickering, employing data and methodologies identical to Todd's, had effectively arrived at Todd's conclusions. As Pickering himself recognized, the primary distinction between Todd and Pickering lay in the designated positions of the unidentified planet, approximately 84 degrees in longitude apart. Hoyt asserts that Pickering's comprehensive account of his research, coupled with Lowell's personal engagement with Pickering's graphical technique, appears to have persuaded Lowell that the issue of a trans-Neptunian planet offered no straightforward resolution. Lowell's final commentary on Pickering's manuscript stated, "This planet is aptly labeled O and is entirely insignificant." Shortly after reviewing Pickering's paper, Lowell dismissed Carrigan from his position. Growing increasingly exasperated by Carrigan's meticulousness, which he had initially requested, and the substantial expenses incurred, Lowell communicated to Carrigan, "I have completed my investigation. I regret not utilizing any of your computations, and found evidence of an external planet located 47.5 astronomical units from the Sun, with a magnitude of 13 plus. Longitude, January 1st, 1909, 287 degrees plus or minus. I will imminently publish my paper. In light of my completion, I will not require any further calculations, although I anticipate seeking your assistance." He would never contact Carrigan again, and his promised paper never materialized, although multiple drafts exist in the Lowell Observatory archives, suggesting he intended to publish the results derived from the graphical methods. A year-long hiatus in the Lowell Observatory archives occurred from July 1909 to July 1910, during which Lowell ultimately, albeit reluctantly, determined that the expedient methods employed by Todd and Pickering were futile. He now confronted a pivotal decision: abandon the problem as insurmountable, or invest additional energy and resources towards its resolution. Lowell, seemingly unhesitant, chose the second path. By 1910, he was deeply engaged in research on perturbation theory. He employed the identical mathematical techniques utilized by Leverrier to identify Neptune and extract another planet from the minuscule residuals in Uranus's motion, which persisted after accounting for Neptune's influence. Lowell's secondary inquiry and memoir, regarding a trans-Neptunian planet. Lowell's obsessive personality and fixation on order were confirmed by his wife, Constance, who documented an incident that transpired shortly after their return from their European honeymoon in 1908. "Shortly after our return from Europe in October, I learned that the scientist's adage is, 'Time is sacred.' I was scheduled to meet him on the train to Flagstaff departing from South Station, Boston, at 2 p.m. Eager to impress him with my punctuality, I boarded the train approximately 10 minutes before departure. Percival entered the vehicle holding his watch approximately 2 minutes before 2 o'clock. He inquired, 'What time did you arrive?' I responded proudly, 'I arrived approximately 10 minutes ago.' He retorted, 'I regard that as equally unpunctual as arriving late. Consider the work you could have accomplished in those 10 minutes. I've never forgotten that statement. Percival never squandered minutes. Planets were subject to stricter standards than trains measured in minutes. After adjustments to Neptune's gravitational influence, Uranus's observed motion still deviated by several seconds of arc from the predicted trajectory. Lowell sought to optimize these discrepancies to uncover the location of an undiscovered planet. The documentation in the Lowell Observatory archives regarding Lowell's fixation on Planet X, which had diminished by 1909, re-emerges in the summer of 1910. Insights into his circumstances during this period can be gleaned from the notes of Edward Pickering, who in late summer 1910 was traveling westward to the International Solar Conference at Mount Wilson. Pickering arrived at the Flagstaff train station late on the evening of August 24th, and presumably resting at the nearby Bank Hotel, rose the following morning at 7, feeling rejuvenated. He walked uphill to the observatory, approximately 2 miles away and 500 feet higher, to the astonishment of other members of the party, most of whom opted to ride. The Lowell Observatory presents an array of captivating exhibits. It features an impressive assortment of illuminated photographs depicting planets and comets, a substantial equatorial telescope, and a reflector. Mrs. Lowell is exceedingly gracious. I encourage her to invite Mr. Lowell to Mount Wilson and guarantee them a warm reception. Roch, Lowell's cousin, requests that I reiterate my invitation to Lowell, who responds, "No, I am an astronomer." I feel somewhat slighted by this remark, as does Roch, who stated he is consistently rather brusque. By asserting, "No, I am an astronomer," Lowell distinguished his field from the rapidly evolving domain of astrophysics. He later clarified to John Trowbridge, president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, that his reference to an astronomer was intentional and specific. He emphasized that astronomer pertains to traditional astronomy, which has been eclipsed by the rising prominence of astrophysics. Lowell contended that this emphasis on astrophysics has obscured traditional astronomy's more profound and significant elements. Despite promoting astrophysical research among his younger colleagues, including V.M. Slipher, whose spectrographic investigations of nebulae yielded pivotal astrophysical insights, Lowell remained committed to astronomy, characterizing it as the elder sister of astrophysics. This was particularly evident in the mathematical pursuit of Planet X, and his resolve to adhere to the traditional 19th-century methodology of inverse perturbation calculations, which had facilitated Leverrier and Adams in their successful discovery of Neptune. In one regard, his endeavor was less challenging than theirs. They had already paved the way. However, in all other aspects, his undertaking was significantly more formidable. Leverrier and Adams resembled the initial climbers of Yosemite's El Capitan, who ascended using ropes, while Lowell was akin to one attempting to scale the nearly vertical, alabaster-smooth wall with only handholds and footholds. This analogy is not entirely fanciful. In 1845, the measurements of Uranus exhibited a substantial error of 133 inches of arc, exceeding twice the size of Jupiter. By the time Lowell commenced his work in 1910, this error had become nearly insignificant. As Lowell himself admitted, today its residuals do not exceed 4.5 at any point of its path. 33. This figure exaggerates what he had to work with, because 4.5 inches was the maximum. Most residuals were 2 inches or less, within the reasonable margins of observational error. This was especially the case for those between 1781 and 1840. Moreover, Lowell had little clear evidence of any systematic changes over time. He was facing the now familiar problem of signal to noise, and he was at least somewhat aware of the fact that, as Hoyt puts it, even the best of methods is no better than the data to which it is applied, and that a constant, coherent body of data for the trans-Neptunian body was lacking, and that much time and labor would be necessary to acquire such data. 34. But Planet X, like the Martian canals which presented a similar signal-to-noise conundrum, had become an obsession by then. His conclusions, based on data that did not convincingly rise above the margins of error, led him to failure in both cases. Following the discovery of Pluto, Ernest W. Brown of Yale re-examined Lowell's calculations with a detached and analytical perspective, concluding, "The primary significance of the residuals between 1750 and 1840 is their convergence towards a linear trajectory. Any form of prediction becomes unfeasible if a planet fails to generate discernible oscillations." We have emphasized that the residuals comprise a combination of uncertainties inherent in the theories of planetary motion and the observations, which are inevitable. The errors, particularly in the pre-1781 observations, were likely significant and had been extensively analyzed by earlier researchers, starting with Bouvard. Although he did not elaborate on his modifications, Leverrier discovered that the average times utilized by Bouvard were erroneous. After rectifying these, Leverrier disseminated revised updates of all observations conducted by Flamsteed and Le Monnier. Lowell must have underestimated the comprehensiveness of the reductions. Otherwise, he would not have anticipated Carrigan to re-evaluate them. Nevertheless, by 1910 he had acquired sufficient knowledge to recognize that the positional accuracy was improbable to enhance through further scrutiny of original sources or new reductions. The raw data, albeit marginal, was as optimal as possible. In 1910 he adopted Leverrier's reductions of the 1873 observations. He assessed the observational errors by categorizing those taken at similar times and employing a questionable least squares analysis. Among the pre-1781 observations, the groups included Flamsteed's observations from March 4th and 10th and April 29th, 1715, Le Monnier's from October 14 and December 3rd, 1750, Bradley's single observation from December 3rd, 1753, Mayer's single observation from September 3rd, 1753, Le Monnier's 8 observations from December 27th and 28th, 1768, and January 15 to 23, 1769, along with one from December 18, 1771. Concerning the probable errors in these, it is noteworthy that Le Monnier's observations, all conducted within the same month, varied by 16.9. This should have provided a definitive understanding of the boundaries of their precision. Similar to Leverrier and Adams, Lowell arranged the residuals, or the least mean squares of groups thereof, for each time interval alongside a series of condition equations. These intricate equations delineated the disturbances induced by the unidentified planet on Uranus's orbit, articulated in terms of the orbital parameters of both Uranus and the unknown planet. Following numerous iterative algebraic manipulations, we determined the orbital elements and the unknown planet's celestial position. The orbital elements included the semi-major axis length, mean motion, longitude at epoch, eccentricity, perihelion, and inclination. Like Adams and Leverrier, Lowell was required to hypothesize a distance. He selected a distance of 47.5 astronomical units from the Sun, deviating from the previously accepted Bode's law. Lowell was aided in this extensive endeavor by several computers, notably Elizabeth Langdon Williams, recognized as the first woman to graduate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and sufficiently skilled in mathematics to occasionally identify and cautiously highlight arithmetical errors in her superior's computations. Lowell, Williams, and other computers operated primarily from Lowell's State Street office in Boston rather than in Flagstaff. This was the same office where Lowell, in his youth, had overseen textile mills, electric companies, and trusts. Among the advanced instruments that facilitated their endeavor were a Thatcher's cylindrical slide rule, promoted as the ultimate cylindrical slide rule, and a millionaire calculator, the inaugural commercially successful motorized mechanical calculator, marketed as the only calculating machine available, that necessitates only one turn of the crank for each multiplier or quotient. It was efficient, yet large and cumbersome, occupying an entire desk. Notwithstanding this inconvenience, it represented an improvement over manually performing multiplication and long division. Lowell recognized from the cometary family signals that multiple trans-Neptunian planets could be pending discovery. For pragmatic reasons, he opted to compute for a singular body encompassing most of the residuals. The issue was significant. The calculations and recalculations conducted by Lowell and his collaborators ultimately occupied approximately 20 large file boxes in the Lowell Observatory archives. By the conclusion of 1910, Lowell and Williams had developed a curve of the perturbations that suggested some peculiar findings, indicating that Leverrier's subsequent theory may not be accurate. They were also close to achieving preliminary results. On March 13, 1911, Lowell's 56th birthday, he telegraphed Lampland, "Please commence photographing the ecliptic to the south with a 40-inch reflector. I hope to transmit the position in a few days. The calculations are exceedingly lengthy." Lowell did not possess a position to assign to Lampland in a few days. According to his secretary Leonard, he was working tirelessly on Planet X and currently suffering from a severe cold, but he refuses to cease working. Despite the exertion, he and Williams did not determine a position for Planet X until the end of April. Heliocentric longitude 235 degrees. It did not endure for an extended period. A week later, Lowell discovered that our residuals, derived from necessities in the case of significant uncertainty, appear to suggest for Planet X a heliocentric longitude of 239 degrees. Kindly prioritize the plates with the 40-inch reflector. Establish the vicinity for 2 degrees or 3 degrees on either side of the fundamental plane, and formulate the optimal comparison method for the unfamiliar entity. These coordinates position Planet X in Libra, yet it is transitioning into Scorpius and the dense star clusters of the Milky Way. Upon examining the celestial region from the current vantage point, I concluded that the 40-inch reflector telescope was entirely inadequate for capturing the plates, and the technique of layering and inspecting them with a magnifying glass proved to be highly ineffective, despite the passage of 3 years. During his time in Europe, Lamond suggested that Lowell procure a newly developed viewing device for plate comparison, known as a blink comparator, from the Zeiss company in Germany. The blink comparator, also known as the blink microscope, was invented by physicist Carl Pulfrich at Zeiss in 1904. It employs an electromagnet to oscillate a small mirror, redirecting the light path alternately from a specific area of one plate to the corresponding area on a second matched plate. Consequently, the image of any planet captured in exposures taken several days apart will reveal itself instantly by exhibiting a back-and-forth motion. Lowell investigated the matter while in Europe, but was indifferent to the concept. By 1911, his perspective had evolved, and as he prepared to travel to Flagstaff to take direct control of the observational phase of the search, he resolved to implement the suggestion. Lowell arrived in Flagstaff on May 8th and stayed until June. The blink comparator reached Flagstaff at that time. It consistently journeyed between Flagstaff and Boston throughout Lowell's lifetime, to blink the Planet X search plates. Subsequently, with alterations, it would disclose Pluto. Upon returning to Boston, Lowell requested the blink comparator and plates shipment, allowing him to pursue his work autonomously. In early July, he communicated with V.M. Slipher via telegram, stating, "Hold comparator and star plates. Hope to be back soon." Unfortunately, the telegram was received too late. Slipher had already returned the blink comparator to Boston. Lowell promptly returned it to Flagstaff. Concurrently, Williams had been re-evaluating the residuals employing Guyot's theory from 1903 rather than Leverrier's from 1873. As previously stated, she and Lowell began to scrutinize the legitimacy of Leverrier's theory in light of the observations made after 1873. This required a recalibration of the condition equations and a revised computational procedure. Williams evidently acted swiftly, and by July, she and Lowell had obtained a preliminary position from Gallo's residuals, which was significantly east of the positions Lampland had acquired merely months prior. Within a few days, the position was revised again. Further adjustments were made to position the planet at approximately longitude 210 degrees, placing it in Virgo rather than Libra or Scorpius. Although a suspicious object retrograding was identified on Lampland's plates in late July, the Lowell Observatory archives offer no clues regarding its potential identity. In conclusion, the object was not Planet X. Subsequently, Lowell shifted his focus to Mars and its most recent biennial opposition, during which he stayed at the observatory from mid-August until February 1912. He and Mrs. Lowell departed for Europe, and the search recommenced only upon their return in May 1912. Lowell was resolute in accelerating the photographic investigation and enhancing the theoretical framework by addressing the longitude and latitude of Planet X. Lampland expressed, "I am convinced that the inclination is significant, both due to the magnitude of the residuals in latitude and the substantial eccentricity of the two factors, which together diminish the mass." By that time, the strain from the calculations was becoming burdensome. Upon returning to Boston in September after a vacation in Maine, Leonard observed that Williams had become a mere shadow from her perplexing computations. Nevertheless, Williams persisted. A few days later, Lowell informed Lampland that he and Williams, now assisted by additional computing aids, were continuing to revise and expand their calculations. However, they had not yet established a new position, and Lowell expressed his frustration, stating, "Every new move takes weeks to accomplish." After October, Lowell's health deteriorated significantly. He was compelled to defer a scheduled visit to Flagstaff and could not visit the Boston office. Leonard conveyed that he could manage only sporadic communication via phone. She expressed concern that he appeared weak and fatigued and must exercise caution and restraint. He is preoccupied with the work. He desires to be involved. She disclosed to her Flagstaff colleagues, hoping he would not be incapacitated as long as he was during his previous breakdown. He is suffering from nervous exhaustion, and his mood is erratic. On certain days, he is unable to make phone calls. He becomes increasingly impatient for matters to progress from Flagstaff. Fortunately, Leonard's most profound anxieties went unactualized. By late January, Lowell was once more transmitting to Lampland the most recent coordinates for Planet X. As per usual, none of these positions remained valid for an extended period, and in early February he dispatched a new set of elements indicating a new position at heliocentric longitude 58 degrees 4 minutes. This recent position placed it in Taurus, in proximity to the Pleiades. Lampland undoubtedly found these incessant revisions exasperating and soon succumbed to his collapse. Lowell implored him to replicate his actions, telegraphing, "Depart and recuperate. I cannot afford to." By spring 1913, Lowell, as observed by Hoyt, appeared to desire to undertake one final significant endeavor to address the issue of planets beyond Neptune. He accomplished this by utilizing observations up to 1910 and examining more intricate facets of the orbits. His initial action involved corresponding with Gallo to obtain residuals in latitude and longitude for Uranus since 1903. Gallo provided the requested data by June, and Lowell subsequently requested similar information for Neptune. In the interim, Williams and the other analysts diligently engaged in the meticulous and labor-intensive process of deriving least mean square solutions. While continuing his recovery, Lowell departed from Boston to the summer residence of his sister, Catherine Bolker, located on Mount Desert Island, Maine. From this location, he maintained communication with Will Williams, consistently engaging with the Planet X project through telegrams and letters from Boston, and relayed succinct progress updates and estimated positions to Lampland, who had since regained his health, in Flagstaff. On August 21st, he sent a telegram stating, "Thus far, the optimal determination for the first power is eccentricity of planet X. For the current position is 239 degrees. And for the second power, likewise, 241 degrees. Utilize these. The suspected inclination is significant, likely directed southward. I remain on the retired list. I am eagerly anticipating any verifiable exciting news. Appreciative." As 1914 approached, Mars again brightened in the sky as it moved toward a January opposition. Lowell advised V.M. Slipher via telegram on August 27, 1913, to rig up the 40-inch for the best possible visual observations at the coming Mars opposition. The 40-inch had originally been acquired for Mars observations. However, since Lampland has used it to capture plates in the search for Plemon-Wheaty, it wasn't needed. When it wasn't needed for Mars observations, Lampland used it to capture plates in the search for Planet X. E-ing was never exceptional for planetary work. At the same time, as Lampland was well aware and had already pointed out to Lowell a year earlier, it was not a good choice for the planet search because of its small field or the distortion of star images at the edges of the plates. Lampland recommended that Lowell acquire a refractor with a double lens, providing a large field. Lowell accepted the recommendation and wrote to John A. Miller, director of the Sproul Observatory at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, to see if an instrument such as Lampland suggested was available. Temporarily. Luckily, it was. A 9-inch Brassiere photographic doublet lens mounted in a camera, giving significantly more light-gathering power than the 5-inch Brassiere instrument used in the earlier phases of the search, was delivered to Flagstaff by April 1914 and set up in a temporary dome on Mars Hill. Lowell's Boston office activity climaxed as the first plates containing the Brassiere exposed themselves to the sky over Flagstaff. Lowell himself, Williams, and the other assistants had been throwing themselves into another gigantic calculation. The last attempt to reach the goal so long and so avidly sought. The bulk of the computations were finished that April, and Lowell accordingly relieved 2 of the assistants, Thomas B. Gill and Earl A. Edwards, of their computing duties, and sent them to Flagstaff to help Lampland with the photographic search with the Brassiere doublet. Lowell was evidently still under severe strain. Mrs. Lowell's ulcer surgery delayed his biennial trip to Europe that spring. In Boston, he was monitoring Mrs. Lowell's recovery and the progress of the search in Flagstaff, with which he was growing increasingly impatient. Graphed Lampland. Don't hesitate to startle me with a telegram. Found. 52. The Lowells set sail for Europe just a week before Great Britain declared war on Germany. They booked an immediate return to the United States. This was to be Lowell's last visit to Europe. Back in Boston, in August, Lowell immediately wanted a progress update from Flagstaff. Not only had the search been halted by the usual July monsoons, but a further medical issue had also taken its toll. Now, it was Mrs. Lampland's turn to need ulcer surgery. Lowell wrote rather plaintively to V.M. Slipher, "I feel sad that nothing has been reported about X, but I suppose the awful weather and Mrs. Lampland's condition may somewhat explain it." No information regarding Planet X was available when he returned to Flagstaff for a brief visit in October. On October 17th, he employed the 24-inch Clark refractor to observe Venus in daylight. Subsequently, at Northwestern University and later as the inaugural director of Chicago's Adler Planetarium, he captured the iconic image of Percival in elegant attire, adorned with a backward-turned soft cap concealing his gleaming bald head, seated attentively in his chair, gazing intently at Earth's solar neighbor. Although Fox concentrated on Venus, his thoughts remained engaged with computations for Planet X as he completed his memoir concerning a trans-Neptunian planet. a manuscript he planned to submit to the Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston. In December, he informed Lampland, "I am presenting my work to the Academy. It would be prudent for you to announce the actual discovery publicly on January 13th concurrently. Memoir regarding a trans-Neptunian planet." No announcement preceded his succinct summary to the Academy on January 13th, 1915. He addressed the same venue where Pickering had delivered his trans-Neptunian graphical predictions 7 years earlier. There was no concise or otherwise response from the attending academicians or the absent astronomers. To further complicate matters, the Academy refused to publish the memoir, which emerged 9 months later as a private publication of the Lowell Observatory. Notwithstanding its extensive popularity, even his brother was the initial biographer, and I concede that a significant portion of the memoir remains opaque. The memoir comprises transformative pages akin to mountain climbing manuals that should only be undertaken by individuals with assured footing and a composed mindset. The forces exerted by one planet on another during their elliptical orbits, even within the same plane, result in a complex scenario. The magnitude of these forces fluctuates with the variation in distance between the planets. This applies particularly when a planet's distance, velocity, mass, or position alters. We must symbolize all these elements, as the orbit's shape is entirely unknown. Will anyone be astonished if these lines, sequentially arranged like regiments across the pages, articulate the connections between the two entities? The memoir is intended for those who profoundly comprehend this variant of solitaire. Lowell encapsulated the findings of his and his assistants' 5-year mathematical endeavor here. Like Leverrier and Adams, he was required to make certain assumptions regarding Planet X's distance from the Sun, commencing with an estimated distance of 47.5 astronomical units. Utilizing this information, and employing the least squares method to minimize errors, he computed the unidentified planet's eccentricity, perihelion position, and mass. He recalibrated the variances for each 10 degrees along the orbit. Through this arduous rearrangement of the cards, he identified 2 potential positions, approximately 0 degrees and 180 degrees, which minimized the residuals. Each of these positions necessitated extensive calculations, predominantly conducted by Williams and her colleagues, though Lowell contributed a significant portion. To ensure accuracy, he recalculated, considering Planet X at varying distances of 40.5, 42.5, 45, and 51.25 astronomical units. The recalculation indicated that the residuals were most accurately explained by a distance of approximately 45 astronomical units. He remained unsatisfied. He computed the second and third orders of eccentricity for enhanced accuracy, but discovered that the supplementary calculations did not markedly alter the outcome. He endeavored to assess the influence on his results if the planet orbited at a steep inclination to the ecliptic, but discontinued the attempt upon recognizing the unreliability of the outcomes. The optimal solutions generated heliocentric longitudes. Solutions yielded heliocentric longitudes. The best solutions gave heliocentric longitudes. The observations took place at 84.0 degrees and 262 degrees on July 1st, 1914. 8. The first position put it in eastern Taurus, moving toward Gemini. The other was in Scorpius, moving toward Sagittarius. The math provided no reason to favor one over the other. However, because the latter would place the planet in an area of the sky that is nearly inaccessible to most observatories, Lowell decided to focus on the former, which is located in the densest thickets of the Milky Way's stars. He estimated that his planet had a mass 7 times that of Earth, with an orbit eccentricity of 0.202 for the first solution and 0.195 for the second. He estimated that his planet had a mass 7 times that of Earth, with an orbit eccentricity of 0.202 for the first solution and 0.195 for the second. Because eccentricity and inclination were usually correlated in other members of the solar system, he guessed that the inclination was likely to be about 10 degrees, a high inclination that, he noted, would make it more difficult to find. He estimated the magnitude at 12 to 13, and the disk's apparent diameter at 1 inch of arc. This gives some idea of what kind of object he and his colleagues were looking for in their plan. He acknowledged that the actual observation could significantly change the outcome compared to the probable errors. He recognized that the actual observation could substantially alter the outcome despite the potential errors. The initial assessment proved accurate. The inaccuracies in the observations, particularly those conducted before 1781, were markedly more substantial than the estimated errors derived from the least squares analysis. He observed that the terms exceeding the squares in the eccentricities of Uranus and Planet X, although excessively cumbersome to address and thus necessarily disregarded, could also change. He concluded his memoir on Planet X with prudence. Additionally, humility. He recalled the exemplary discovery of Neptune by Leverrier and Adams, whose analytical techniques had motivated his own adoption of similar methods. Leverrier's solution resulted in inaccurate boundaries, underscoring the necessity to thoroughly understand the problem via a meticulous and exhaustive approach. This does not diminish Adams and Leverrier's exceptional analytical prowess in their adept approach to the problem. That alone warranted success. Nonetheless, the accomplishment is unexpected, as Leverrier excluded terms exceeding 2, which he ultimately retained. The proximity of Neptune and the near circularity of its orbit elucidate the phenomenon. If this had applied to the accommodating Neptune, it was even more so for Planet X. Although the investigation illuminates historical shortcomings, it does not preclude us from acknowledging contemporary issues. The solution curves indicate that an appropriate adjustment in observational errors would modify the minimum point for the varying mean distances, or the mean longitudes. A minor increase in actual errors relative to expected errors could significantly change the probable distance of the disturbance and its longitudinal position at that moment. The probable error of a set of observations does not apply to anyone acquainted with observation. Errors arising from systematic causes consistently exceed it. He remarked with a nearly divine indifference. Due to the inaccuracy of our data, we cannot view our results with the satisfaction or completeness we desire. As Joseph Louis Lagrange and Laplace posited, they had demonstrated that our system is perpetually stable. Subsequent studies, however, demonstrated that their conclusions were erroneous. Likewise, the techniques employed by Leverrier and Adams to identify an unknown object now operate solely under particular conditions, guarantee the accuracy of a rifle while acknowledging its dependence on the indiscriminate nature of a shotgun, despite the weapon's inherent instability. Nonetheless, comprehending the overarching solution and the constraints of a problem can be equally enlightening and consequential as achieving a specific, exact solution. Lowell had abandoned his pursuit when the Memoir on a Trans-Neptunian Planet was published in September 1915. Lampland endeavored to bolster Lowell's waning spirits. In August, he stated, "X is not yet visible, but I remain optimistic about its proximity. We must not relent at this juncture." Subsequently, he composed a comparable correspondence to Miller. "Despite our inability to identify the distant planet, we remain resolute. You're becoming fatigued from prolonging the duration for the 9-inch. Nevertheless, we maintain hope, in certain aspects at least. Each day reinforces the belief that additional effort could resolve the issue. After extensive labor on a problem, how does one despise capitulation?" From Lowell's viewpoint, the undertaking produced no outcomes. The topic of Planet X, previously the focal point of considerable activity at the Lowell Observatory, subsequently vanishes from Lowell's correspondence. Gill's observational log indicates that Lowell briefly visited the 9-inch telescope on October 8, 1915, while the photographic search with that instrument persisted until July 2, 1916. On that date, a notation appears in its customary position, lunch, implying that the activity was only momentarily interrupted. Lowell would not resume the project during his lifetime. Hoyt observes that Lowell refrained from publicly conceding defeat. Rather, he typically dismissed it and redirected his attention to other matters. Contemplating his brother's discussions with Lampland during the height of the search, Abbot Lawrence, Lowell may have inferred. Amidst the jesting, one can perceive the desire to uncover the elusive planet and the lamentation over the confusion of his aspirations. The most profound disappointment of his life was the failure to locate X. The concluding year. Lowell now had less than a year to live. At the beginning of 1916, he was in Flagstaff to observe Mars during its less than favorable February opposition. In addition to the usual staff members, he was joined by George Hall Hamilton, who had left a position at Bellevue College in Nebraska to spend the period around the opposition at Flagstaff as a volunteer observer, saw the canals much as Lowell did, and would later marry Elizabeth Williams, Lowell's chief computer on the Planet X project. Meanwhile, Lowell continued to add to the buildings on Mars Hill. With Mrs. Lowell's advice on architectural designs, he planned the construction of the administration building, now called the Slipher Building, into which the astronomers would move by the end of the year and in which Pluto would be discovered long afterward. After briefly returning to Boston after the Mars opposition, Lowell was in Toronto in April, delivering a speech titled "The Genesis of the Planets," apparently announcing the next topic he hoped to investigate. He told a correspondent in May, "Eventually I hope to publish a work on each planet, the whole connected together, but the end is not yet." 64. During that autumn, he traveled throughout the Pacific Northwest, lecturing on Mars and other planets at various institutions, such as Washington State and Reed Colleges, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, as well as Stanford and Berkeley in California. More exhausted than he was himself aware, wrote his brother. And he returned to Flagstaff, eager about a new investigation. He had been planning on Jupiter's satellites. 65. He hoped that Barnard would discover Amalthea, the fifth satellite of Jupiter, at the Lick Observatory in 1892. This satellite would function as a probe to investigate the internal structure of the giant planet and ascertain whether the presumed molten inner core is more oblate than the outer gaseous envelope. Earl Slipher diligently monitored the positions of the fifth satellite night after night during late October and early November. Their final documented observations occurred on the evening of November 11th. On the morning of Sunday, November 12th, 1916, Lowell was in his residence, referred to as the baronial mansion, when he experienced a severe cerebral hemorrhage from which he never regained consciousness. He passed away at approximately 10 p.m. That evening, Mrs. Lowell meticulously inscribed in chalk on the wall of the room, "Percival Lowell's earthly existence concluded in this chamber upon the green couch." He departed from the Lowell Observatory, leaving behind the unaccomplished quest for Planet X as part of his legacy, Clyde's Planet. Beginning in July 1916, when Thomas Gill utilized the 9-inch Brashear doublet lens to expose the final photographic plate, a span of 13 years would elapse before another plate was exposed at Lowell Observatory in the quest for Planet X. Although the Lowell Observatory's pursuit of a trans-Neptunian object languished following Lowell's demise, his principal competitor, William H. Pickering, who had retired from Harvard and resided on a plantation in Mandeville, Jamaica, remained engaged. He consistently published new predictions for hypothetical planets, designated as P, Q, and R. In each instance, the orbital elements were derived rather casually and ambiguously from graph-based evaluations of residuals or statistical analyses of cometophilia. In contrast to Lowell, who recognized the ambiguities in his data upon completing his research on a planet beyond Neptune, Pickering failed to progress beyond a haphazard and unscientific approach. His predictions proliferated like sturgeon eggs and were met with appropriate indifference by most astronomers. Only his initial planetary forecast, Planet O, prompted a genuine search. In 1919, Milton L. Humason utilized a 10-inch Cook refracting telescope at the Mount Wilson Observatory to expose multiple plates in the area believed to contain Pickering's planet, but was unsuccessful. Ironically, Pluto appeared as a faint image on certain plates, yet it eluded detection then. Interest in the trans-Neptunian planet was not rekindled in Flagstaff until the mid-1920s. The distant and frigid sphere of Lowell's aspirations had consistently occupied the thoughts of his devoted team. Yet financial resources had been insufficient to undertake any concrete efforts to locate it. The deficiency of funds stemmed from Lowell's widow, Constance, a former interior decorator and real estate entrepreneur, from whom Percival had acquired his 3-story brownstone row house at 11 West Cedar Street in Boston following his mother's demise. She was ostensibly a devoted, agreeable, and compatible companion from 1908 until his death 8 years later. However, doubts had consistently surrounded her, even within the extended Lowell family. One can only conjecture why Percival, one of the nation's more eligible bachelors, opted to wed a woman who was not conventionally attractive and, at 44 years old to her husband's 53, could scarcely be expected to bear him an heir, wrote the late William Lowell Putnam III, sole trustee of the Lowell Observatory. She had been on the shelf matrimonially for years, and there is no documentation of Percival's sentiments. Was there a significant influence of familial pressure? Putnam attributed his marriage to the incessant pressure from Lowell's 2 elder sisters, and found himself contemplating why he did not wed his capable, appealing, and unerringly loyal secretary, Rexy Louise Leonard. Nevertheless, he remarked that this was likely implausible, as respectable Bostonians of that era did not wed their secretaries. Following Lowell's demise, Constance assumed the role of antagonist, and in the subsequent years, she's garnered few, if any, advocates. Her husband's body was scarcely cold when she dismissed Leonard. Subsequently, a disagreeable, contentious, avaricious, and pathologically litigious facet of her character surfaced that had not been evident during her husband's lifetime. As Putnam stated, viewed retrospectively, the marriage was a catastrophe of the highest order for the advancement of astronomy. Mrs. Lowell maintained a firm grip on her husband's estate, a predicament that was only rectified following an expensive and lengthy legal battle, during which the observatory was compelled to significantly reduce its operating budget. Upon Lowell's demise, a court-mandated audit of his estate disclosed a notably conservative portfolio, prominently featuring substantial investments in various utility bonds and established entities like AT&T, amounting to $2,336,813.77, equivalent to over $40 million today, as of February 5, 1917. Upon Mrs. Lowell's completion of the matter on November 30, 1925, the value had diminished to below 50%, $1,105,017.08. The majority of the disparity, naturally, had dissipated into the possession of attorneys. This calamitous litigation caused the Lowell Observatory to be perceived as notoriously insolvent. The Lowell Observatory was entirely neglected during the Roaring Twenties. No financial resources were accessible to procure an appropriate telescope for a renewed investigation of Planet X. It was only after the resolution of the litigation that Guy Lowell, Percival's cousin, and the inaugural sole trustee of the observatory following Percival's demise, obtained two incomplete 13-inch glass discs from the estate of the deceased amateur astronomer and optician, the Reverend Joel Metcalf, as an initial measure to reinvigorate the search. Nevertheless, he abruptly passed away from an intracerebral hemorrhage in early 1927, resulting in yet another interruption. Roger Lowell Putnam, the nephew of Percival, succeeded him as the sole trustee, leading the project with a significant $4,000 contribution from Percival's brother, Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard, who primarily financed the telescope. Carl A.R. Lundin, the chief optician at Alvan Clark and Sons, fabricated a 13-inch doublet lens utilizing the Metcalf discs. The telescope and its dome, designed by Stanley Sykes and inspired by his brother Godfrey's design for the Clark refractor dome, were to be situated in the United States. Forest Service land was transferred to the Observatory, located several hundred feet northwest of the main building. At that time, the staff comprised only 3 astronomers: Director V. M. Slipher, his brother Earl Slipher, and Carl Lampland. Their focus was on their individual research, particularly Trustee Putnam's primary objective at that time: the publication of a new book on Mars, which the astronomers viewed more as an obligation than a source of enjoyment, resulting in sluggish progress. With the new telescope approaching completion and the imminent resumption of the Planet X search, it became evident that an assistant was required. However, financial resources remained limited. The selected individual needed to be youthful, healthy, and prepared to exert considerable effort for minimal financial compensation. V. M. Slipher informed a fellow young astronomer that compensation in astronomy is likely inferior to that in other intellectual pursuits with more commercial ties. If remuneration significantly impacts your current or future career decisions, it is improbable that anyone would advocate for a pursuit in astronomy. Nevertheless, astronomy and numerous other sciences offer more than mere financial compensation. A youth from Kansas. Timing is paramount. And as the observatory began its search for an assistant, a young farmer from Kansas, Clyde W. Tombaugh, aware of the Lowell Observatory's esteemed reputation in planetary studies, promptly inquired for an assessment of his sketches of Mars and Jupiter, which he had created using a homemade 9-inch reflecting telescope in the autumn of 1928. Although his fascination with astronomy had been cultivated earlier through observations of the moon and planets. With a Sears and Roebuck 2.5-inch refractor, Tombaugh soon desired a more powerful telescope and, like many others, resolved to construct one himself. He constructed multiple mirrors, with the third attempt featuring a 9-inch aperture, which exhibited exceptional quality and delivered crisp views of the planets with magnification capabilities of up to 400 times. The mechanical components of the telescope included a base derived from a cream separator, while another element utilized the crankshaft from his father's 1910 Buick. Tombaugh selected an opportune moment to commence his observations of the planets. Jupiter was characterized by intricate and swiftly evolving features, as it experienced one of its periodic dramatic disturbances in the south equatorial belt, offering much to observe and depict. He produced precise replicas of his drawings and dispatched them to Lowell Observatory. V. M. Slipher was positively impressed by Tombaugh's sketches and promptly recognized that the young Kansas farmer, who had an interest in astronomy, could be the ideal candidate to assist in the renewed search for Planet X. Slipher later expressed, "I believed we would likely receive more genuine assistance from this young man than from the highly trained individuals, as the latter are primarily interested in pursuing new projects for themselves, rather than aiding us with the ongoing work of the observatory." Tombaugh was offered a position with a monthly salary of $125 and accommodation on the second floor of the observatory's administration building, constructed in 1916, and he accepted without hesitation. In January 1929, he embarked on a train journey from Larned, Kansas to Flagstaff. Before the train's departure, his father, Muron, imparted the counsel, "Clyde, render yourself useful and be cautious of promiscuous women." He seems to have adhered to both advice pieces, and has rendered himself useful. Upon his arrival at the platform in Flagstaff, the assembled 13-inch telescope closely followed. It took several months to establish and calibrate the telescope, during which Tombaugh was a versatile assistant. His responsibilities encompassed loading coal and wood into the furnace of the administration building, removing snow from one of the telescope domes, and conducting afternoon tours for visitors. Those days entailed registering astronomical images on glass plates, followed by applying light-sensitive chemicals, photographic emulsion. The plates utilized for the Planet X search measured 14 by 17 inches and required a slight curvature to ensure optimal star focus across the entire surface due to their dimensions. Due to the minuscule diameter of the smallest star images, approximately 0.3 millimeters, if the images were not identical in size and shape across both plates of a pair, the plates would be deemed unblinkable, meaning they could not be effectively analyzed using the blink comparator. All plate sections needed to be within 0.13 millimeters, 1/200th inch, of the instrument's focal surface to ensure the focus of all star images. The precise curvature of each plate was achieved through pressure screws on the rear, while a testing table, engineered by V.M. Slipher, employed a lengthy amplifying arm to meticulously verify the curvature of each plate in the holder before its insertion into the telescope. Under Slipher's guidance, Tombaugh acquired the skills to modify the curvature of his plates and insert them into the telescope. To achieve an exposure lasting an hour or more, he required a brighter guide star, chosen from Norton Star Atlas, to be centered in the eyepiece of the guide telescope. Following several nights of supervised work, Slipher determined that Tombaugh had passed and was now sufficiently competent to work autonomously. At this juncture, Slipher ceased his visits to the dome. On April 6, 1929, Tombaugh conducted an initial test exposure focused on the star Delta Cancri during the third Planet X search. 2 nights later, he revealed the initial plate in the constellation Gemini, focused on Delta Geminorum. Although it was already significantly advanced in the western sky, Gemini was the region that captivated Slipher's interest, as it was here that, according to Lowell's final computed positions, the planet was presumed to be concealed. Ironically, this plate and a companion plate revealed on April 30th captured faint images corresponding to Pluto. These images went unrecognized at the time due to Gemini's low position in the sky and atmospheric refraction, which resulted in poor image alignment. Additionally, the Pluto images were significantly fainter than anticipated for Lowell's Planet X, which he estimated to be of magnitude 12 or 13. Particularly in frigid conditions, the pressure exerted by the screws frequently caused the plates to fracture, with the initial Delta Geminorum plate succumbing to this issue. Numerous other plates ultimately fell victim to this phenomenon, and in subsequent years, Tombaugh would frequently jest, "I should have possessed the foresight to recognize that this was the location to discover the elusive little rascal." Operating the telescope for extended periods in an unheated dome at 7,000 feet was arduous. As Mount Wilson astronomer Robert S. Richardson, who was well acquainted with Tombaugh, later remarked, "Without experience in direct astronomical photography, it is hard to understand the amount of work involved in such a search. Part of the work is plain physical labor, and although it is not quite as strenuous as swinging a sledgehammer in a rock quarry, it can be extremely tiring. One has to open the dome, set the telescope, load placeholders, and attend to a dozen other minor tasks. Tombaugh once told me that dodging wild animals on the path to the little dome was another hazard. The most boring part of the job is sitting for hours beside the telescope, guiding it to make sure it is always pointed in precisely the right direction. Speaking from personal experience, sitting up with a telescope is much worse than babysitting. The highest type of babysitting requires an alert, aggressive mental attitude on the sitter's part, while guiding a telescope requires practically no mental attitude. If time permits, a plate may become defective after an hour of work, requiring the sitter to take it again. Or clouds may come up suddenly and spoil the whole night's work. Tombaugh appreciated the diversion provided by his radio, which received a Mexican station from across the border. Following exposure, Lowell scrutinized the plates utilizing the blink comparator he obtained at Lampland's behest in 1911. This apparatus significantly enhanced both speed and precision compared to the antiquated technique of superimposing plates and inspecting star images with a handheld magnifying glass. Although employing the comparator remained a laborious and monotonous task, it rendered the process of sifting through millions of star images, any of which could potentially be the desired planet, feasible for humans. The Slipher brothers examined the initial Gemini plates developed by Tombaugh, but did so ineffectively. As Tombaugh persisted in exposing plates, he assumed that the senior astronomers would maintain their interest in reviewing them, as the individual who did so would assume responsibility for the success or failure of the search. He found it hard to believe that a newly appointed assistant would undertake such a significant obligation. However, the Slipher's initial enthusiasm for the project quickly diminished, leading to an accumulation of plates as Tombaugh exposed them more rapidly than the Slipher's could analyze. Tombaugh continued to expose plates on Gemini, which by April 1929 was already 90 degrees past opposition, the point where this region of the sky was directly opposite the Sun. By mid-June, Tombaugh had reached the opposition point while progressing backward through the zodiac. The location where Planet X would be positioned directly opposite the Sun, if it were to exist. He was now presenting his plates to the star-laden regions of the Milky Way in Scorpius and Sagittarius, where the latter of Lowell's theoretical solutions had located the planet, although Lowell chose to disregard this solution and focus on the one in Gemini, as the dense clusters of stars in this area would have made the search nearly unfeasible. Tombaugh observed that the star images on these plates were threefold more numerous and densely clustered than those of Gemini, while each 14 by 17-inch plate exposed on Gemini featured approximately 300,000 stars. Those exposed on Scorpio and Sagittarius contained over 1 million. As Tombaugh solemnly contemplated, to select a singular image that altered its position is an exceptional task. Following a month of examining Tombaugh's plates, V.M. Slipher was beginning to lose interest, or at least acknowledging that the endeavor greatly exceeded the time he and the other senior astronomers could allocate to it. After June, as Flagstaff's monsoon season neared, rendering photographic work more sporadic, Slipher visited Tombaugh's office to declare that he would capture the plates and prepare them for use. Tombaugh later conjectured that the older individuals, having experienced the frustrations of previous searches during Lowell's lifetime, may have unconsciously resigned themselves to failure. They may have had a significantly more transparent motive. Tombaugh acknowledged, "This was the most tedious work ever done." Richardson states that collecting the plates constitutes merely a portion of the task. Upon acquisition of the plates, they must be meticulously scrutinized for any moving objects. Regrettably, the comprehensive scanning of a pair of plates requires several hours, as only an area measuring less than 1 square inch, 1 centimeter by 2 centimeters, can be observed at any given moment. Not every object that leaps is inherently a new planet. It is astonishing how many imperfections can exist in a photographic emulsion that would produce exceptional planets. Tombaugh determined that the most effective method to eliminate these spurious objects was to capture 3 plates of the identical star field weekly, despite this procedure augmenting the observing program by 50%. Upon comparing the 2 plates, one was removed from the machine, and the third was inserted. We would subsequently re-evaluate the suspect plates to determine if they continued to exhibit movement. On this occasion, only a limited number of them did. A project of this nature would not be particularly challenging if 2 individuals undertook it. one transporting the plates at night and the other illuminating them during the day. However, it evolves into a full-time occupation when the same individual must manage and blink the plates, allocating time for sleep and occasional shaving. The entire project became all-consuming for Tombaugh, not solely due to the monumental nature of the task. He identified himself as a perfectionist. He later reminisced about the farm in Kansas, stating, "When I sowed the Kafir corn and Milo maize, the rows across the field had to be perfectly straight, or I was dissatisfied. Consequently, we had to examine every suspected planet, regardless of its faintness, using the third plate. It was a definitive yes or no, not an uncertain maybe. I have consistently adhered to the adage from a school book: perform a task proficiently or refrain from undertaking it altogether." The immense scale of the project and Tombaugh's steadfast resolve to execute it efficiently led to a personal crisis. As Tombaugh subsequently elucidated, "I observed numerous asteroids that altered their positions between the dates the plates were captured. How can I identify which one is Planet X? Numerous tectonic regions were devoid of a tertiary plate, with some situated near the asteroid's equilibrium points. I could not acquiesce to conducting a planetary search in such a disorganized fashion. I was in a condition of despondency. Given this ambiguity, I perceived no purpose in continuing. I engaged in introspection. The absence of a university education and degree impeded my capacity to engage in alternative scientific pursuits. Asteroid stationary points are locations where asteroids, while changing direction relative to the background stars in their retrograde loops, seem to decelerate to a near halt. During these intervals, the asteroids traverse the celestial sphere at such a languid pace relative to the stars that they could readily be misidentified as a planet drifting slowly beyond Neptune. Notably during Uranus's proximity to its stationary point. In 1769, Le Monnier conducted 6 observations over 9 days and did not detect its motion. In July, Tombaugh remained despondent regarding the situation as he boarded the train for a 3-week visit home. He would have the opportunity to meet his infant sister, whom he had not yet encountered, and assist with the wheat harvest. Upon his return to Flagstaff amidst the ongoing monsoon season, he systematically addressed the asteroid issue. He meticulously examined the American Ephemeris and Nautical Almanac, and observed the temporal variations in the daily coordinate positions of Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, particularly during their oppositions and various stationary points. Suddenly, the solution became clear. By exposing his plates solely near the enemy positions, he recognized that any object in orbit beyond Earth would be captured during its swiftest retrograde motion through the field. This was essential. The retrograde loops illustrate Earth's motion caused by parallax. Thus, the closer the celestial body is to Earth, the more rapid its movement through the loop. By exclusively displaying the plates adjacent to the opposing positions, we can circumvent the stationary points of the asteroid. Furthermore, individuals captured on the plates will be readily recognizable. Ironically, Lowell had comprehended the same notion much earlier, yet his efforts to convey this to his assistants had not resonated. Consequently, when Pluto's image was discovered much later on 2 plates developed by Gill in March and April 1915, it was revealed that this area was photographed at an angle of 90 degrees from opposition. Shortly after Pluto's apparent stationary point, Tombaugh subsequently recognized that this methodology was fundamentally flawed in the quest for planets. The Flagstaff monsoon season concluded in mid-September, permitting Tombaugh to recommence exposing plates along the zodiac. He executed the task with revitalized fervor. He now joyfully pursued the opposing point through Aquarius and Pisces, describing them as charming areas with hundreds of spiral galaxies to observe and relatively sparse in stars, approximately 50,000 per plate. Tombaugh asserted, I could process a pair of plates in 3 days of work. Although he was examining areas 120 degrees from Lowell's location for Planet X, he remained unconcerned. He had always doubted the calculated positions, which varied significantly with each revision. He now understood that discovering a planet or planets would depend solely on diligent effort utilizing his new, highly efficient equipment. By November, he had persevered through Aries and was approaching Western Taurus. He was again retreating towards the Milky Way, revealing plates encompassing tenfold the number of stars found in the Aquarius and Pisces fields. Spiral galaxies vanished due to the obscuring interstellar dust clouds of the Milky Way. He remembered there appeared to be a growing sense of anticipation among the senior astronomers. He conjectured regarding the motivations for this. It is possible that Slipher was receiving inquiries from Putnam. Similarly, Lampland appeared to be becoming apprehensive. I labored intensely, completely disregarding the 8-hour workday. I experienced growing acceptance as I was incorporated into all activities and discussions, with intermittent visits from other astronomers. Numerous individuals paused in Flagstaff for a day or two en route to or from the astronomical hub, the Mount Wilson Observatory. Their 100-inch telescope was the preeminent telescope globally. I conversed with renowned astronomers I had previously studied in literature. I completely overlooked homesickness. I was completely engrossed in the moment. Listening to their research findings about the universe was captivating. By January 1930, Tombaugh was advancing into eastern Gemini, where one of Lowell's calculated positions, projected to January 1930, indicated the planet. Returning to the location he had commenced 9 months prior. Given his extensive experience, he recognized that the Sliphers had processed the 1929 Gemini plates too rapidly. Consequently, he resolved to rephotograph Gemini. He acquired 3 plates on January 21st, 23rd, and 29th. The initial image was subpar, with the stellar visuals obscured by a strong northeast wind. The remaining items were acceptable. On February 7th, as moonlight disrupted photographic tasks, Tombaugh resumed blinking, placing the plates on the blink comparator in the administration building 1 floor beneath his apartment. He concluded, blinking at plates from the eastern Taurus region. Subsequently, around February 15th, he positioned the Delta Geminorum plates on the blink comparator and examined them over the following days. On Tuesday, February 18th, he persisted in analyzing hundreds of thousands of stellar images. The day commenced like any other, yet it culminated in an unforgettable experience. The revelation. Tombaugh arose at approximately 7 a.m., traversed the mile to downtown Flagstaff, and consumed breakfast. He primarily dined downtown, favoring the Black Cat Cafe directly opposite the train station. He returned to the blink comparator by 9 a.m., preparing for another monotonous day of examining plates. He dedicated 3 hours to the comparator's microscope eyepiece, intermittently pausing from the mentally taxing endeavor. Without these intermissions, his vision would begin to blur the images, and his focus would wane. At noon, he drove to the Black Cat for lunch and returned an hour later for an extended blinking session. The subsequent events are most accurately recounted in Tombaugh's own words. While commencing a new strip east of Star Delta, I unexpectedly observed a 15th magnitude object. That is it, I declared to myself. I immediately observed the images in a 1 by 2 centimeter area comprising approximately 300 stars. During all the months of observation, I had never encountered a planet that appeared so promising. I removed 1 plate and positioned the January 21st plate, acquired during inclement weather, on the comparator. The enlarged depiction of Planet X was exactly in its expected location. For 45 minutes, I was the sole individual aware of the precise location of Planet X. Carl Lampland was seated at his desk in the adjacent room. He perceived the abrupt cessation of the clicking sound from the blink comparator, followed by an extended silence. He consequently suspected I had discovered something and was nearly overwhelmed with suspense, he later informed me. I contacted him to examine the new planetary images and clarified that the shift was appropriate for a trans-Neptunian planet. I proceeded down the corridor to VM Slifer's office. Slifer was seated at his desk, engaged in paperwork. I confidently entered his office. "Doctor?" "Slifer, I have discovered your Planet X," I stated. He sprang from his chair, expressing enthusiasm, yet his voice conveyed hesitation. He rapidly advanced toward the blink comparator room, and I had to regulate my pace. Lampland relinquished the comparator to Slifer, remarking, "It appears quite satisfactory." The atmosphere was charged with anticipation as I swapped the plates. Ultimately, Dr. Slifer instructed me, "Re-photograph the area at your earliest convenience." Upon gazing out the window, I observed that clouds predominantly obscured the sky. "The prospects for tonight appear bleak," I remarked, "but I shall remain vigilant throughout the night." Dr. Slifer replied, "Do not disclose the discovery to anyone. The news may pose a danger. We must maintain confidentiality for several weeks to analyze the object." I proceeded downtown to dine at a cafe and fulfill my routine obligation of collecting the observatory's mail from the post office. After dinner, I observed that the sky was significantly overcast. I was exceedingly exhilarated and needed to compose myself. I attended the Virginian performance featuring Gary Cooper at the Orpheum Theatre, an evening I will always remember. Following the gunfight, my knees trembled more than ever. After the performance, I often lingered outside to observe the sky. I relinquished my efforts shortly after midnight as the third quarter of the moon was set to ascend. The sky was relatively clear that night, and I acquired a new plate. I anticipated the planet's image to be positioned 10 to 11 millimeters further west. Indeed, it was precisely in its expected location. The subsequent night, following the creation of a finder chart, Lampland, Slifer, and I proceeded to the 24-inch refractor for visual observation. Shortly thereafter, Slifer acquired it. "I possess it," he stated. "Yet I do not observe any disk." His voice tinged with melancholy. It was exhilarating to recognize that we were examining regions of the solar system previously uncharted by anyone. It was also disheartening. The planet appeared exceedingly dim and insignificant. Stellar point. The absence of a disk in the 24-inch refractor caused hesitation among the observers, prompting Slifer, despite his enthusiasm, to withhold the announcement of the discovery. The Lowell Observatory had already endured considerable ridicule regarding the Martian Canal controversy. He refrained from publishing anything until he could attain absolute certainty. Nonetheless, he conveyed the information to the observatory's trustee, Roger Lowell Putnam, who relayed it to Percival's sibling, Abbot Lawrence Lowell. The latter told Slifer, "The remarkable news if it proves to be accurate. Associating Percy's name with those of Leverrier and Adams would constitute a notable and merited distinction, and it would unequivocally enhance the prestige of the observatory." In the weeks following the discovery, the object, despite the high expectations surrounding it, remained merely an object at this stage, was monitored through photographic surveillance by Lampland using the 40-inch reflector. It was unquestionably trans-Neptunian and provided ample justification, aside from the concerning absence of a disk, to consider it Lowell's Planet X. On March 12th, Slifer obtained adequate confirmation to relay the information to the Harvard College Observatory. His telegram was succinct. The systematic search initiated years prior, augmenting Lowell's inquiry into the trans-Neptunian planet, has uncovered an object that for 7 weeks has exhibited a rate of motion and trajectory that consistently aligns with the trans-Neptunian body at an estimated distance he designated, 15th magnitude. The position on March 12 at 3 hours GMT was 7 seconds west of Delta Geminorum, consistent with Lowell's predicted longitude. The subsequent day, marking the 75th anniversary of Percival Lowell's birth and the 149th anniversary of Herschel's discovery of Uranus, a Lowell Observatory. Observation Circular was disseminated, wherein Slipher provided additional details, including the name of the assistant astronomer who discovered the object for the first time. The trans-Neptunian object was located merely 5 degrees 9 from Lowell's anticipated longitude, approximately the same distance as that between the 2 pointer stars of the Big Dipper. Slipher refrained from designating the object as a planet, yet he didn't have to do so. The media capitalized on the revelation as sensational news and made conclusions. 9th planet, larger than Earth discovered, accompanied by a subheading indicating that the planet may possess a mass comparable to Jupiter's. Clearly, there were significant biases favoring identification with Planet X, considering the substantial financial and emotional investment in the search. The resolution of the protracted drama effectively addressed numerous issues faced by the Lowell Observatory. The majority concurred that it effectively addressed the enduring problems at the observatory. It convinced Roger Lowell Putnam to give the staff astronomers an indefinite reprieve from completing their long-delayed and superficially accepted Mars book. The discovery initiated a rivalry among astronomers in calculating an orbit. The Lowell Observatory aspired to be the first, yet none of its astronomers possessed specific expertise in orbital calculations. Consequently, John A. Miller, from Swarthmore College's Sproul Observatory, an old acquaintance from whom Lowell had previously borrowed the 9-inch Browse-Here doublet lens utilized in the second search, was invited to Flagstaff for this purpose. In the weeks following the discovery, Miller, the Sliphers, and Lampland convened daily at a large table, utilizing logarithmic tables to meticulously conduct the orbit calculation. Armin O. Leuschner, a globally recognized expert in calculating asteroid and comet orbits at the Students' Observatory of the University of California, requested positional data from Slipher to perform similar calculations. Frank E. Seagrave, an amateur astronomer from Providence, Rhode Island, also did. Seagrave possessed a private observatory at present-day Peeptoad Road in North Scituate, Massachusetts, which remains operational. He was a talented amateur orbit calculator who 1910 generated the most precise forecast for the return of Halley's Comet. He was a friend of Lowell, and on March 14, 1930 corresponded with Slipher. Many years ago. The late Dr. Lowell assured me that should the Lowell Observatory discover X, he would permit me to be among the first to calculate its orbit. Thank you in advance for any information you can provide regarding this intriguing planet. 15. Evidently, Slipher did not respond, prompting Seagrave to write again on April 15th. I dispatched a letter around mid-March requesting photographic documentation of the outer Neptunian planet, the newly discovered asteroid, or the recent comet, whichever it may be. As of this date, I have not received any communication from you. I seek clarification on why the newspapers reference positions attained in January and February. The final occasion I was in the company of the late Doctor. Percival Lowell was in September 1916. At that time, he was preparing to depart from Boston. I was with him at the Lowell Observatory office, 53 State Street, Boston, for Flagstaff, and intended to stay at 3 or 4 locations en route to deliver lectures. He presented his calculations concerning the outer Neptunian planet and disclosed his findings. Seagrave, should the Lowell Observatory be the first to discover this planet, you will be the initial individual to calculate its orbit. This is solely a verbal declaration with no written documentation to support it. I am curious, why you did not send me any positions, given that you appear to have sent some to Dr. Miller of Sproul. Dr. Van Biesbroek from Yerkes Observatory provided me with 4 coordinates. On this occasion, Slifer replied, I aimed to showcase several initial positions of Lowell's trans-Neptunian object, Planet X, but the day was inadequate. Indeed, for weeks, the days have been insufficient for us to accomplish necessary tasks, resulting in our unintended appearance as unfriendly or discourteous to many commendable individuals such as yourself. Before disclosing the discovery of Dr. Lowell's Planet X, we needed to establish a preliminary orbit for it. Lowell Observatory appeared most prudent in locating and assessing whether the object was less significant than originally perceived. Dr. Lowell and the observatory had invested considerable effort into the issue, thereby validating this policy. We recognized that special attention was required in this situation and endeavored to exercise caution. This pertains to the overarching issue excluding the orbit. Dr. Miller collaborated with the observatory on the orbital calculations. Despite receiving multiple urgent requests for early positions, including yours, we did not disseminate precise positions for orbital purposes. We are confidently sending you the enclosed positions before anyone else. You will perceive our efforts to be equitable. Despite advancements in the theory of orbital calculation since astronomers contended with the challenge of determining Uranus's orbit in the 8th and 10th centuries, the fundamental principle remained largely unaltered. Success was an ambiguous outcome for an object monitored over a brief segment of its orbit. The challenge stems from the reality that any observation conducted from the moving Earth provides solely 2 quantities: the angular coordinates of the object. This indicates the direction along a line to the object rather than the distance. Subsequent observations acquired over time provide alternative insights. 6 elements delineate an orbit, requiring a minimum of 3 observations. All 6 quantities must be measured precisely to determine the object's orbit and position at any specific moment. The quantities were approximately known in the months following the discovery of the new planet. Consequently, the initial orbits were rudimentary. Under Leuschner's guidance, his graduate students at Berkeley, Ernest C. Bauer and Fred L. Whipple, arrived first. According to a Harvard College Observatory announcement card, dated April 7th, and a Lick Observatory bulletin released a week later, they had. They determined a set of solutions indicating a distance from Earth of approximately 41 astronomical units and an orbital inclination of 17 degrees. They remarked that no definitive conclusion regarding the eccentricity and period can be established without observations spanning a significantly longer duration, and that it was not even feasible at that time to ascertain whether the object's orbital trajectory was oriented toward or away from Earth. Meanwhile, the Lowell computers were completing their tasks. On April 12th, Slifer transmitted the results to Putnam, who relayed them to Harlow Shapley, the director of Harvard College Observatory. In concurrence with Bauer and Whipple's findings, they designated the object an eccentricity of 0.909, rendering the orbit nearly parabolic for 3,000 years. The newspapers promptly reported the story, with headlines likely unwelcome at the Lowell Observatory, including "Planet X orbit raises more doubt," and "Lowell Observatory estimates classified trans-Neptunian object as asteroid or comet. Trajectory is long ellipse." Slifer maintained his optimism that the object would be the new planet predicted by Lowell. On April 19th, he told Miller, "Leuschner appeared to consider it an asteroid or comet, precisely the type of object he engages with daily. According to our understanding, planet most accurately characterizes the object." On that same day, he corresponded with Putnam. "If it is a comet, it is distinct from all other known comets. If it is an asteroid, the same applies. If it is a planet, it possesses the most extraordinary orbit. Conversely, Jupiter's outer satellites exhibit analogous variations in size and orbital characteristics. A comparable alteration in the celestial bodies of the Sun's system may exist between Neptune and Planet X. He proceeded, somewhat presciently. Your inquiry regarding size and mass lacks a straightforward response. Once the orbit is precisely ascertained within a year or two, evaluating its perturbative effects on other planets will be feasible, thereby allowing for an estimation of its mass. Thus, Planet X may possess a mass thousands of times greater than all the asteroids combined. Thus, it only resembles asteroids in apparent size due to its vast distance. We unequivocally favor the designation planet, rather than asteroid or comet. The discovery of Planet X required considerable time, suggesting that ascertaining its true nature may necessitate additional time and effort. Regardless of its merits, this provokes more contemplation than anything encountered in a considerable duration. We would have favored a more luminous object and a more suitable orbit. Designate it as Pluto. The calculations of the orbit and inquiries regarding the precise characteristics of what remained designated as the Lowell object would persist for an extended period. Certainly only a limited number of specialists could comprehend the intricacies. Simultaneously, the search for an appropriate name for the planet was imminent. Before the formal announcement on March 13th, Putnam had sought Mrs. Lowell's recommendations, to which he weakly proposed Zeus. Foreseeing the anticipated objection, she informed Slifer, "Mr. Putnam inquired whether I had any reflections. He stated that he had contemplated Diana. Zeus is my selection. Some individuals erroneously conflate Zeus with Jupiter. However, based on my research, this is inaccurate. Jupiter is a Roman deity, whereas Zeus is a Greek deity." Meanwhile, Putnam inclined toward Cronus, a suggestion possibly made by his mother Elizabeth, Mrs. William Lowell Putnam II, Percival's sibling. It may have been accepted were it not for the involvement of another astronomer, Thomas Jefferson Jackson C., who had a brief and contentious tenure at the Lowell Observatory in the 1890s and was so reviled by his colleagues that they referred to him as a reptile. The simple association of C with the name rendered it impractical. Minerva emerged as a compelling option, endorsed not only by Putnam and the New York Times, which deemed it particularly suitable for the planet that sprang to human view fully equipped from the mind of man, but also by nearly half of the correspondents to Putnam and the Lowell Observatory. It is important to note that Minerva was also John Herschel's selection for Neptune. Ultimately, we also had to dismiss it, as it had already expended its energy on an asteroid. After Slifer's announcement, Putnam declared that public suggestions were encouraged. Subsequently, a deluge ensued. Numerous suggestions emerged, including Atlas, one of Putnam's initial preferences, and Zymal. Mrs. Lowell reconsidered her stance on Zeus and opted to contribute once more. Despite Putnam's belief that Percival Lowell would favor a classical name, she asserted that the gods of the past are worn out. On March 14th, she communicated to Slifer, "In Eastern newspapers and at a luncheon today, there is a unanimous demand that the planet be named Percival, and we hope that you at the observatory who made possible its finding will be in sympathy with the appropriateness of the name." However, Percival did not succeed, nor did her subsequent choice, Constance. An especially captivating proposal, albeit seemingly never dispatched, was presented by H.P. Lovecraft, the horror author, who encountered Percival Lowell at a lecture delivered by Lowell at Sales Hall, Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, when Lovecraft was 16 years old. He was deeply interested in developments and corresponded with his friend Elizabeth Aldridge. The discovery of an asteroid may lack substantial significance, whereas the discovery of a major planet, an expansive unknown realm, carries greater importance. I have long desired to witness such an occurrence, and now it has manifested. the first genuine planet discovered since 1846, and only the third in human history. One contemplates the nature of its frozen surface and the obscure fungi that may emerge in the dim light. I propose it be designated as Yuggoth. I'm also pleased that the newcomer was identified at the Lowell Observatory and through Lowell's own computations. Unfortunate individual. His more renowned observations and speculations have historically struggled in the scientific community. However, 13 years posthumously, it is conceivable that his calculations may secure him a significant position among astronomers. Concurrently, multiple authors proposed the name Pluto, including an individual identifying as Nostradamus, and another named L. The name Blood was also independently suggested by an 11-year-old schoolgirl, Venetia Burney, who presented it to her grandfather, Falconer Madan, a retired librarian of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Madan conveyed the suggestion to his acquaintance Herbert Hall Turner, the civilian professor of astronomy and director of the Radcliffe Observatory at Oxford. Turner, who passed away unexpectedly a few months later, concurred that it was an excellent selection and communicated this to Slipher via telegram. The Madan family evidently excelled in this regard. Madan's brother, Henry, a science master at Eton College, proposed Phobos and Deimos for Mars's 2 satellites to Asaph Hall in 1877. The designation was particularly fitting, as Pluto represented the god of the underworld and was the sibling of Jupiter and Neptune. Slipher officially proposed the name in a Lowell Observatory observation circular on May 1st. By then, astronomers, especially in Europe, had already begun to informally adopt the term Pluto. Slipher observed that the initial letters corresponded with Percival Lowell's initials and suggested an anagram utilizing the initials P and L for its planetary symbol. Overall, the name was met with enthusiasm, although some dissenters remained, including Mrs. Lowell, who continued to wear mourning attire and was rumored to conduct séances to connect with her husband's spirit. In the summer of 1930, she visited the Lowell Observatory, eager to meet the young man credited with discovering my husband's planet. As recently as New Year's Day 1931, she told Slipher, "I wish the planet could be called Planet X, not Pluto. I do not like Pluto for the name." Notwithstanding Mrs. Lowell's inclinations, the name gained considerable popularity, extending beyond the realm of astronomers. For instance, the burgeoning public fascination with the newly discovered planet inspired animator Walt Disney to name his canine character Pluto the Pup, who debuted in his cartoon features in the same year as the discovery. Another was William H. Pickering. Almost like a voice from the grave, Pickering, now 72 and in retirement on his old-fashioned plantation in Jamaica, pointed out that whereas Pluto was found 5.9 degrees from the position Lowell had predicted, it lay only 5.6 degrees from the place of his own planet O. It was also discovered that Pluto had been registered on Humeson's 1919 Mount Wilson plates, but overlooked. While claiming this success, Pickering forgot to mention that he published an updated orbit for planet O in 1928, which did not match the actual planet very well. He also favored 3 planets instead of just one as the cause of the changes that affected Uranus. Lowell Observatory seems to have fretted about Pickering for a while, though probably the final verdict on him was accurately pronounced by trustee Roger Lowell Putnam, who wrote to V.M. Slipher, "I don't think I should worry much about Pickering's predictions. I think he has predicted just about everything, from 1 planet to 3 in varying positions. At any rate, Dr. Lowell predicted it, and you have found it, which is more than Pickering has done." Nevertheless, Pickering continued his intermittent fulminations. As early as April 10th, 1930, he penned an article for Popular Astronomy, to which he had long been a regular contributor, complaining that the name Pluto had been adopted for the object discovered at the Lowell Observatory. By early 1931, he was arguing that because the planet penetrated Neptune's orbit, it ought to be called Salacia, or Amphitrite, after the wife of Neptune, while reserving Pluto for planet P, which, as deduced from comet Ophelia, revolved around the Sun at 70 astronomical units. As he wrote a few months later, he even claimed to have mentally reserved the name Pluto for planet P. Pluto had appropriated it, prompting him to joke that it should have been named Loki, in honor of the god of thieves. 31. Eventually, he mellowed as a series of refined computations of Pluto's orbit showed it to be truly trans-Neptunian. A definitive orbit was finally published in 1931 by Ernest Bauer, Leuschner's graduate student involved in the early efforts. Pluto was indeed trans-Neptunian, and moving in an orbit that bore only the most general resemblance to Lowell's planet X. Where Lowell had surmised a planet with a highly elliptical orbit at a mean distance from the Sun of 43 astronomical units, and an inclination to the ecliptic of 10 degrees. The object, planet, comet, asteroid, or whatever, discovered by Tombaugh, was situated at a mean distance of 39.4 astronomical units, in an orbit that proved to be the most eccentric and sharply inclined of any planet. When farthest from the Sun, as it will next be in 2113, it reaches a distance of 7.4 billion kilometers, 4.6 billion miles. At perihelion, which occurred in 1989, its distance is merely 4.4 billion kilometers, 2.7 billion miles, and it traverses well within the orbit of Neptune. However, there is no possibility of a collision, as the significant inclination of its orbit, 17 degrees, places it over 1 billion kilometers above the plane of Neptune's orbit. The steep orbital inclination indicates that Lowell's search from 1905 to 1907, focused on the ecliptic, was doomed to fail. The planet was positioned so distantly from the ecliptic that it fell outside the search area captured by the plates. Although Gill conceived it in 1915, it was too indistinct to be acknowledged during the declining days of optimism for the search. Completing each solar circuit requires 248 years. Thus, the planet will not revisit Tombaugh's discovery until 2178. The subsequent perihelion passage will occur in 2237. Simultaneously, another prominent figure in celestial mechanics, Ernest W. Brown of Yale, released a scathing critique of the calculations that resulted in the discovery. Brown reassessed Lowell's research and discovered that the measurements of Planet X's distance, mass, and orbital shape were influenced by 3 sets of observations before 1783, which contained substantial inaccuracies. By the conclusion of his investigation, Lowell himself had harbored similar suspicions. He recognized that his entire calculation would be invalid if the actual observational errors surpassed the assumed probable errors. Brown noted that Lowell employed the identical methodology utilized by Leverrier in the discovery of Neptune. This method entailed reducing calculation errors, which Lowell accomplished with precision and thoroughness. Brown identified an error in the initial phase of Lowell's analysis. He provided no plausible errors for his results, nor did he weigh the residuals utilized. Brown determined that the method by which we assess information in this type of problem is crucial. The hypothesis's validity primarily depends on potential errors in the unidentified variables. Lowell had been pursuing an illusion. Notwithstanding his valiant endeavors and those of his computers, akin to the canals of Mars, he had extended his dubious data beyond its limits. Nonetheless, if he committed mistakes, they were productive, as Brown acknowledged. To the extent that Lowell's work has incited a quest for an outer planet, which has yielded success, one cannot lament its finalization and dissemination. However, after dismissing the alleged residuals, we could not extract any perturbations from them. Furthermore, as Brown observed, Pluto was significantly dimmer, presumably less massive, than anticipated. Thus, it could not be Lowell's Planet X. Lowell anticipated that it would possess a mass 6.6 times that of Earth. Reflecting Peirce's sentiments following Neptune's discovery, Brown asserted, "The fact that it was located near the predicted position was entirely coincidental." After reviewing Brown, Pickering altered his stance and advocated for Lowell's calculations, and by extension, his own. He contended that both he and Lowell, employing distinct methodologies, had successfully anticipated the location of the planet, and concluded, "One of us should exclusively receive primary credit for it. We calculated the position and luminosity of the minor planet for specific dates using various methods. I defer the determination of which method yielded a more reliable result, based on the recorded deviations for Uranus and Neptune, to others. Neither Lowell nor I ever observed any of these plates. Consequently, we bore no responsibility for discovering the planet depicted on them, except that Lowell allocated funds for the search. I did not make such a gift. If his proximity to the actual position was merely coincidental, it was undoubtedly a fortuitous occurrence. Had it not been for his bequest, it would not have occurred. The planet would likely have required years to be located. Thus, he should have received recognition for this significant discovery." Pickering's commendation of Lowell for initiating and facilitating the search was poignant, yet somewhat imprecise. In November 1930 and again in May 1931, Pluto was positioned within a fraction of a degree of Jupiter. At Mount Wilson, Seth B. Nicholson, who discovered Jupiter's 9th satellite in 1914, utilized the 100-inch telescope to monitor his moon. In November 1930, Nicholson corresponded with W. H. Wright of the Lick Observatory and remarked, "Have you observed that Pluto has been positioned in the same field as Jupiter's satellites? The final image depicted Jupiter 6, Himalaya nearby. I believe Pluto will be in the same category as Sinope. Had Tombaugh postponed his efforts by a year, he could have significantly reduced his workload." Despite being unwelcome, particularly to astronomers at the Lowell Observatory, Brown's determination that Pluto lacked sufficient mass to be Lowell's Planet X has endured over time. Pluto's mass is insufficient to influence the giant planets. During 1930 to 31, this was suspected. Slipher and Putnam expressed concerns, but it had not yet been conclusively established. Bauer endorsed Brown's stance, noting that even Lowell had expressed no great confidence in his findings. The opposing side could substantiate their argument by citing British astronomer Andrew Claude de la Chèvre-Crommelin. He was interested in celestial bodies beyond Neptune, and had previously assisted Lowell by supplying data regarding Uranus from the Greenwich Observatory in 1909. Crommelin acknowledged that Lowell had exaggerated Pluto's mass, but defended the integrity of his work, adamantly rejecting the notion that the precision of Lowell's or Pickering's forecasts could be coincidental. In 1934, inspired by Sir James Jeans, Crommelin proposed a potential method to reconcile Pluto's mass with its stellar-like appearance in large telescopes. He suggested that what was observed might be a specular reflection of sunlight from a surface as smooth and lustrous as a ball bearing. Thus, what appeared against the black sky was merely this central, bright spot, not the actual extent of the object. Although Griffith Observatory astronomer Dinsmore Alter contemplated the notion as late as the early 1950s, it lacked persuasiveness. Even if Pluto had possessed a smooth, lustrous surface, it could not have preserved its sheen over millions of years of impacts from comets and meteoroids. Another proposal that emerged within a year of the discovery was to consider it exceedingly dense. It may be as diminutive as it seems, yet sufficiently substantial to qualify as Planet X if, for instance, it possessed a density 12 times that of Earth or 60 times that of water. Indeed, extremely dense entities composed of highly compressed matter such as white dwarfs, are recognized. Ultimately, these were merely hypotheses likely to endure until we ascertain Pluto's diameter. Astronomers must wait to complete the 200-inch Palomar telescope, which is nearly 2 decades away. Concurrently, the German astronomer Walter Baade conducted significant observations of Pluto. During his tenure as an astronomer at Hamburg Observatory from 1930 to 1931, Baade ascertained multiple precise positions for Pluto and endeavored to measure its magnitude accurately. In 1931, he departed Germany for the United States and became a Mount Wilson Observatory staff member. In March and November 1933, he initially endeavored to ascertain Pluto's luminosity through photographic photometry, utilizing the 60-inch and 100-inch telescopes. He determined the photographic magnitude of Pluto to be 15.58 plus or minus 0.02, which is marginally dimmer than Pluto at its mean distance from the Sun. Baade also assessed the planet's luminosity using colored filters, resulting in the inaugural determination of Pluto's color index. The findings indicated that Pluto is not gray, but rather reddish. As a subtle reddish entity, Pluto's measured attributes appeared inconsistent with the Gens-Crommelin theory of highly reflective, icy body. The most direct inference from Baade's research was that Pluto is a diminutive entity of likely negligible mass. It is now evident that Tombaugh's discovery of Pluto was fortuitous, akin to Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery of X-rays and Henri Becquerel's discovery of radioactivity. During his quest for a planet, he discovered something potentially more momentous: the most luminous object in the Kuiper belt, acting as a harbinger 60 years before its anticipated emergence. The discovery was attributable to Lowell's inspiration, but equally, if not more so, to Tombaugh's diligent effort. Lowell, a man with an obsessive personality, possessed a profound desire for clarity, favoring stark definitions devoid of ambiguity or nuance. Ironically, he had invested his highest aspirations in a great maybe. In his essay Is Life Worth Living? Without directly mentioning Lowell, James effectively encapsulated Lowell's contributions by contemplating, attempting to quantify and ultimately bequeathing his vision of the great maybe that was Planet X, which materialized as Pluto. Perhaps, one now hears the positivist derisively exclaim, "What utility can a scientific existence possess with uncertainties?" Indeed, I respond, the essence of a scientific existence is heavily intertwined with uncertainties, while human existence is entirely contingent upon them. To the extent that an individual advocates for a cause and demonstrates productivity or creativity, his vital function can be characterized as engaging with uncertainties. No victory is achieved. No act of fidelity or bravery is performed without uncertainty. No service, creative endeavor, scientific explanation, experiment, or textbook is devoid of potential error. We only truly live by risking our lives moment by moment. Frequently, our pre-existing faith in an unverified outcome is the sole catalyst for its realization. The pursuit persists. In subsequent years, Tombaugh frequently expressed that Pluto was significantly dimmer than anticipated for a planet at its calculated distance, leading him to harbor doubts regarding its status as a legitimate planet. Upon the calculation of the orbital parameters, it became evident that it possessed an orbit significantly more eccentric than that of any other planet, along with a pronounced inclination to the orbital plane of the 8 known planets, thereby intensifying the existing doubts. Undoubtedly, while the Lowell Observatory was not impartial and highly incentivized to validate its planetary status, Roger Lowell Putnam remarked soon after its appearance on Clyde's photographic plates, "The new object, irrespective of its nature, is a profoundly intriguing discovery. If it is not exclusively planetary, it enters an entirely new category, which is, in certain respects, more exhilarating." Putnam's observation would later prove to be remarkably insightful. The persistent uncertainties regarding Pluto prompted V.M. Slipher to sanction expanding the planetary search along the ecliptic and broader sky regions. Initially, Tombaugh employed the same method to search for Planet X. He acquired the plates and compared them through blinking. The inaugural year's plates featured a solitary strip positioned centrally along the ecliptic. The search was subsequently optimized to simultaneously capture two strips of the sky, one to the north and one to the south, parallel to the ecliptic strips. Under favorable observational conditions, acquiring the plates was simpler than analyzing them. By the conclusion of the Flagstaff monsoon season in September 1932, Clyde had made significant progress. A continuous band 30 to 35 degrees wide, comprising 3 contiguous strips encircling the sky, had undergone blink examination. Adverse observing conditions during the winter of 1932 hindered the extension of a second strip to the south. However, in subsequent years it became feasible to photograph 2 strips simultaneously, positioned at increasingly greater distances from the ecliptic. Tombaugh observed, "An intensive observing program exerted pressure on the available telescope hours when numerous nights of illumination were not entirely satisfactory." Imposing the conditions frequently resulted in acquiring the third check plate. In transient haze patches, the absorption intensity and duration were assessed, resulting in an extended exposure, occasionally reaching 50 to 100%. Nonetheless, the star images generally corresponded effectively with the blinking. A minimum level of semi-alertness was necessary to perform the monotonous task of maneuvering the plates. Undoubtedly, blinking necessitated greater mental acuity than the exposure of the plates. He remarked subsequently, "The duration required to meticulously examine a designated region on comparable plates correlated with the number of star images when exceeding 400 per square inch. Nonetheless, when the number of star images was reduced, the duration required was correlated with the dimensions of the plate. This is due to a relatively stable quantity of spun various grain aggregations in the photographic emulsion that draw attention, regardless of stars on the plate." Following the discovery of Pluto, Tombaugh was awarded a scholarship to the University of Kansas in Lawrence, where he completed his bachelor's degree from 1933 to 1935, excluding the summers when he returned to Lowell Observatory. As the sole surviving discoverer of a planet, he was explicitly prohibited from enrolling in the introductory astronomy course, which was considered beneath his dignity. He encountered his future wife, Patricia Edson, whose brother was also an astronomy major and a close associate of Tombaugh, who resided as a student lodger in their home. Tombaugh wed Patricia in 1934, and they spent summers at Lowell Observatory, where he persisted in his planetary search. Residing on Mars Hill in a modest, brown-shingled cottage that lacked a refrigerator, telephone, or washing machine, relying on wood fires for cooking and heating. During Tombaugh's absences in Lawrence, Frank K. Edmondson, an alumnus of Indiana University, temporarily undertook the photographic work. Between 1936 and 1938, supported by 2 grants from the Penrose Fund of the American Philosophical Society, 2 individuals advanced the project. Henry Giklas, a Flagstaff native whose father contributed to the establishment of the 42-inch reflector on Mars Hill, and who was employed by V. Mouse or N. Sum. Sir, as a general assistant, acquired the majority of the plates, allowing Tombaugh to dedicate his entire focus to analyzing them. He discovered that 3 to 6 hours per day was the maximum duration he could engage with efficiency. An optimal day involved scrutinizing 30,000 to 60,000 stars for planetary movement. In 1939, Tombaugh initiated a series of deep photographic plates in sparsely populated stellar regions and excluded 1,500 planetary candidates of 17th and 18th magnitudes by comparing them with third plates. He conducted this investigation to eliminate the possibility of any region of asteroids exceeding the 18th magnitude beyond Saturn's orbit. In May 1943, he finalized the primary program, having photographed and conducted blink examinations of the entire sky observable from Flagstaff, spanning from 50 degrees to the North Celestial Pole. He estimated that he had accumulated 7,000 hours at the blink comparator and analyzed approximately 90 million star images. Tombaugh conducted the work with meticulousness and comprehensiveness, and he was assured no undiscovered planets brighter than 16th magnitude could exist. Moreover, he was assured that his inquiry would likely succeed in identifying planets of 16th to 17th magnitude. From 1943 to 1945, Tombaugh instructed Navy personnel in navigation at Arizona State College, presently known as Northern Arizona University. In August 1945, he briefly returned to Lowell Observatory, dedicating the subsequent months to finalizing the blink examination of certain unfinished plates in northern sky regions. Due to insufficient funds, Lowell Observatory could not rehire him, prompting his departure, tinged with bitterness, from the institution where he had made his enduring discovery. He concluded the year as a visiting assistant professor of astronomy at UCLA, and, in 1946, transitioned to the ballistics research laboratories at White Sands Proving Ground, currently White Sands Missile Range, where he engineered telescopes to monitor rockets and missiles during test flights. He directed the US from 1953 to 1955. The Army's near-Earth satellite search, executed at Lowell Observatory, entailed cataloging the region surrounding Earth in anticipation of the inaugural launch of artificial satellites. In 1955, he relocated to the Physical Science Laboratory at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, where he, in conjunction with Bradford A. Smith and others, established the university's Planetary Patrol and Study Project, which continued from 1958 until 1973, the year of Clyde's retirement.